The grizzly rose on its hind legs, towering 7 feet tall against the fading light of dusk. Its roar echoed across the valley, sending birds scattering from nearby pines. Mason Reed stood his ground, the Winchester rifle steady in his weathered hands. 20 yards behind him, a newborn calf lay trembling in the tall grass, its mother already lost to the bear's earlier attack. "Easy now," Mason whispered, though not to the bear. The words were for himself, a ritual from his days in the war, a way to steady his breathing when death circled close. The bear charged. Mason fired once, twice. The second shot caught the beast in the shoulder, slowing but not stopping its advance. 15 yards. 10. The massive creature's breath visible in the cold autumn air. Mason had time for one more shot before the bear would be on him. He exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger. The bullet found its mark in the grizzly's chest. The animal staggered, momentum carrying it forward 3 more steps before crashing to the ground just 6 feet from where Mason stood. The valley fell silent again, save for the soft whimpering of the calf and the pounding of Mason's heart in his ears. He approached the fallen bear cautiously, rifle still ready. Its eyes were open but vacant, massive paws now harmless in death. Mason knelt beside the creature, placed a hand on its coarse fur. "Sorry, old one," he murmured. "These hills were yours long before they were mine." Blood seeped through Mason's shirt. The bear's claws had caught him across the ribs during its final lunge. He'd feel it properly later when the rush of survival faded. For now, he turned to the orphan calf, gathering the trembling animal into his arms. Night was falling fast, and the temperature with it. The calf wouldn't survive alone. As Mason carried his burden homeward, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. He paused at the ridge overlooking his property. 100 acres of tough mountain grazing land, a 2-story cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, a barn and corral. Isolated, defensible, alone. "Elena," he whispered to the stars, a ritual as familiar as breathing. 10 years gone, and still her name was the first word that came to his lips when he cheated death. The people of Shadow Creek called him the Ghost of the Valley, a name whispered with equal parts respect and fear. Mason Reed, who could track anything across impossible terrain. Mason Reed, whose aim never faltered. Mason Reed, who spoke less than 10 words when he came to town for supplies each month. Mason Reed, who had died inside the day they put Elena in the ground. Sheriff Colton watched through the window of his office as Mason Reed tied his horse outside the general store across the street. Even from this distance, Colton could see the fresh bandage peeking from beneath Mason's coat. Another encounter with the wilderness, no doubt. The man seemed to collect scars the way other men collected coins or cards. "He's in town again," Deputy Wilson said, hanging his hat on the rack by the door. "I can see that," Colton replied, not turning from the window. "First time in what, 3 weeks?" "4, not since the harvest festival he didn't attend." Colton nodded. "Keep an eye on him, not too close." "Still don't trust him? After all this time?" "It's not about trust." Colton finally turned from the window. "It's about a man carrying too many ghosts. Those kinds of men are unpredictable." Wilson shrugged but didn't argue. Everyone in Shadow Creek knew the fragments of Mason Reed's story. Widower, war veteran, father to 2 girls no one hardly ever saw. What they didn't know were the pieces Colton kept to himself. The blood they'd both spilled at Fort Gibson, the oaths they'd broken, the reason Mason's eyes still burned with something dangerous whenever their paths crossed. Some histories were better left buried, but Colton knew from experience that buried things had a way of clawing back to the surface, especially in these mountains. Sarah Reed folded the last of the clean laundry, setting it in neat piles on the kitchen table. At 15, she moved with the efficiency of someone much older, her movements precise and practiced. The cabin was spotless, dinner bubbling in the iron pot over the fire, cornbread cooling on the windowsill. She'd learned years ago that keeping busy kept the emptiness at bay. "Hannah," she called toward the stairs, "come finish your lessons before Pa gets home." A muffled groan answered from above, followed by the reluctant shuffle of small feet. Hannah appeared at the top of the stairs, a book clutched to her chest, her dark hair falling in tangled waves past her shoulders. At 10 years old, she was the spitting image of their mother, something Sarah caught their father noticing with a flash of pain whenever Hannah laughed. "I was reading the good part," Hannah complained, descending the stairs. You can read the good part after your arithmetic, Sarah replied, setting out the slate and chalk. Pa will want to see you've done your figures. Hannah slid onto the bench at the table, sighing dramatically. Pa never checks my work anyway. He just nods and says, "Good girl," even when I get them all wrong. Sarah bit back the sharp response that rose to her lips. Hannah was right, of course. Their father went through the motions of parenting like a man sleepwalking, present in body, but rarely in spirit. It had been that way since their mother died, bringing Hannah into the world. "Just do your work," Sarah said instead. "I'll check it myself." The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Sarah moved to the window, scanning the darkening yard for any sign of their father. Instead, she saw only the gathering storm clouds to the north, promising early snow. Her hand drifted unconsciously to the locket at her throat, the only thing of their mother's that she owned. "He'll be home soon," Hannah said quietly, suddenly beside her at the window. Small fingers slipped into Sarah's hand. "He always comes home." Sarah squeezed her sister's hand, swallowing the knot in her throat. "Yes, he does. That's one thing Pa never breaks, his promises to us." The door opened with a gust of cold air. Mason Reed filled the door frame, his tall figure silhouetted against the twilight. In his arms, he carried a trembling calf. "Girls," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Need hot water in the medicine box." Sarah moved instantly, recognizing the tension in her father's shoulders that spoke of injury. Hannah darted forward, her arithmetic forgotten. "Is it hurt bad, Pa?" she asked, reaching to stroke the calf's soft head. "Orphaned," Mason answered, carrying the animal to the hearth. "Mother was taken by a grizzly. This little one won't last the night without help." Hannah's eyes widened. "A grizzly? Did you—" "It's done," Mason said flatly. "Sarah, my side needs tending too." Sarah was already heating water, the medicine box open on the table. She'd been stitching her father's wounds since she was 12. The calf would be Hannah's responsibility. Her sister had a way with animals that bordered on miraculous. As Sarah helped her father remove his coat, she saw the blood soaking through his shirt. 3 long gashes across his ribs, not deep enough to be fatal, but serious enough to need careful cleaning. "You should have gone to Doc Miller in town," she said quietly, cutting away the fabric around the wound. Mason's jaw tightened. "Don't need the town's help." "You can't keep doing this, Pa," Sarah said, cleaning the wound with steady hands that betrayed none of her concern. "These mountains will take you one day, and then what becomes of us?" For a moment, something flickered in Mason's eyes, awareness perhaps, or regret. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar, distant gaze. "The mountains won't take me," he said, his voice low. "Not until I let them." While Sarah worked on her father's wounds, Hannah had made a bed of blankets for the calf near the fire, coaxing the frightened animal to drink from a bottle of warmed milk. The domestic scene might have appeared wholesome to an outsider, a father and his daughters in their mountain home, tending to each other and the creatures in their care. But Sarah knew the truth that haunted the spaces between them. This wasn't a home, it was a fortress against memory. And her father wasn't really living here with them. He was just waiting, marking time until something gave him permission to stop. That night, like every night, Mason sat on the porch long after his daughters were asleep. The temperature had dropped below freezing, but he barely felt the cold. The freshly stitched wounds in his side throbbed dully, a counterpoint to the older, deeper ache that never left his chest. The moon rose over the eastern ridge, casting silver light across the valley. In this light, the land looked like it had when he'd first brought Elena here as a young bride. Untamed, beautiful, full of promise. They'd built the cabin together, dreamed of filling it with children's laughter. For a time, they'd had exactly that. Then came the fever after Hannah's birth. 3 days of helpless watching as Elena slipped away, too far from town. The mountain passes already blocked by early snow. 3 days of prayers to a God he'd stopped believing in during the war. 3 days, and then silence. Mason had buried her on the hill behind the cabin, beneath the aspen grove where she'd loved to sit in summer. He'd made the coffin himself, carving her name into the headstone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Then he'd taken his infant daughter inside to the sister who was too young to bear such responsibility, but did it anyway. That was the day Mason Reed had stopped living and started merely surviving. He took a swig from the flask in his pocket, the only comfort he allowed himself. The whiskey burned a path down his throat, momentarily displacing the cold. From inside came the soft bleating of the orphaned calf, followed by Hannah's gentle shushing. Mason closed his eyes, letting the familiar sounds of night settle around him. The distant howl of wolves in the high country, the creak and shift of the cabin's timbers, the whisper of wind through bare branches, and beneath it all, like always, the voice he couldn't forget. Promise me you'll live, Mason, really live, really. For the girls! Elena's last words, spoken with her final strength. The promise he'd made and broken in the same moment, because when she'd gone, she'd taken all possibility of really living with her. The wind shifted suddenly, bringing with it the scent of snow and something else, a premonition of change that raised the hairs on the back of Mason's neck. He'd learned to trust such warnings in the war, and later as a scout. Something was coming, something that would test the fragile balance he'd maintained these 10 years. Mason Reed rose to his feet, scanning the darkness beyond his land. Whatever approached, he would face it as he faced everything since Elena's death, with empty eyes and a loaded rifle. The ghost of the valley had nothing left to lose but his daughters, and those he would protect until his final breath. Above him, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small figure standing alone in the vast wilderness. Mason whispered Elena's name one last time before going inside, locking the door against the night and whatever tomorrow might bring. The first flakes of snow began to fall 3 days later, gentle white specks against the gray morning sky. Mason stood on the porch, watching the weather with eyes trained by a lifetime in the mountains. These weren't the innocent harbingers of a light dusting. The clouds on the northern horizon carried the dense, ominous weight of a blizzard. "Sarah," he called, turning back toward the door. "Storm's coming. We need to prepare." His elder daughter appeared in the doorway, already wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "How bad?" "Bad enough. 2 days, maybe 3. Mason gestured toward the barn. "We need to bring in extra firewood, check the animals, secure the shutters." Sarah nodded, the set of her shoulders revealing both her competence and the unfair burden of responsibility she'd carried since childhood. "I'll get Hannah to help with the chickens and fetch water." "No," Mason shook his head. "Keep her inside. I don't want either of you out once the storm hits proper." "We've weathered blizzards before, Pa," Sarah said, a hint of impatience in her tone. Mason's gaze returned to the northern sky. "Not like this one." He couldn't explain the certainty he felt, the same premonition of change that had settled into his bones 3 nights ago. This wasn't just weather approaching, it was something more. "I'll finish the baking and pack away anything that might freeze," Sarah said, accepting her father's judgment without further question. She'd learned long ago which battles were worth fighting. Mason nodded. "I'll check the north fence and the stock. Make sure Hannah stays close." By midday, the snow was falling steadily, the wind beginning to drive it sideways. Mason had repaired a section of fence damaged by a fallen branch, counted the cattle in the lower pasture, and brought the 2 horses into the barn. Now he was splitting wood in the yard, each swing of the axe driving back the cold that tried to settle in his bones. His side ached where the grizzly had marked him, but he ignored it. Pain was merely information, not a command. The orphaned calf was doing well under Hannah's care, already forming an attachment to the young girl who fed and comforted it. Mason suspected they'd have another mouth to feed permanently once spring arrived. He couldn't find it in himself to mind. Hannah had so few joys in this isolated life. The crack of the axe splitting another log was nearly lost in a sudden gust of wind. Mason paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the approaching storm. A scraping, dragging noise from the direction of the north trail. Mason set down the axe and reached for the rifle that was never far from his side. He moved silently toward the edge of the yard, eyes scanning the tree line. The snow was falling heavily now, visibility reduced to less than 50 yards. The sound came again, something or someone struggling through the deepening snow. Mason raised the rifle to his shoulder, waiting. A figure emerged from the whiteness, staggering with each step. Not a threat, at least not an immediate one. A person on the verge of collapse. As the figure drew closer, Mason could make out more details. A woman, her dark hair whipping in the wind. Her clothes, what remained of them, were not made for a mountain winter. She stumbled again, fell to her knees, then forced herself back up with visible effort. Mason lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't set it aside. Strangers in these mountains were rare, especially in approaching winter. Strangers who looked like this woman, clearly not white, dressed in tattered clothing that spoke of violence rather than mere poverty, were something else entirely. Something that usually meant trouble. The woman saw him then. She stopped, swaying on her feet. Even across the distance that separated them, Mason could see the wariness in her posture. The way she assessed him, the cabin behind him, the rifle in his hands. She was deciding whether he represented safety or further danger. Mason made no move toward her. His experience had taught him that cornered creatures, human or animal, were at their most dangerous when desperate. The woman took one more faltering step forward, then collapsed face down in the snow. "Pa!" Hannah's voice came from behind him. Despite his instructions, his younger daughter had ventured onto the porch. "Pa, someone's hurt." "Get back inside," Mason ordered. But Hannah was already running toward the fallen stranger, her coat unbuttoned and flapping behind her like wings. "Hannah!" Mason barked, but it was too late. His daughter knelt beside the unconscious woman, already turning her over, brushing snow from her face. "She's freezing, Pa," Hannah called. "We have to help her." Mason crossed the distance in long strides, rifle still ready. Up close, he could see what the storm had partially concealed. The woman's clothes were not merely tattered, but deliberately torn. Bruises darkened her bronze skin, and raw marks around her wrists told of recent restraints. Her face, though battered, held a quiet dignity even in unconsciousness. She was Apache. The high cheekbones and straight black hair were unmistakable. "She's hurt bad," Hannah said, her young voice trembling. "Like that calf. We can't leave her out here to die." Mason hesitated. An Apache woman, alone and injured, meant complications he couldn't afford. It meant questions and possibly pursuit. It meant danger for his daughters. "Please, Pa," Hannah pleaded, looking up at him with eyes so like Elena's that it made his chest ache. Mom would have helped her. The unfair invocation of Elena hit Mason like a physical blow. Hannah barely remembered her mother. How could she know what Elena would have done? Yet she was right. Elena, with her healer's heart, would never have hesitated. "Get back to the house," Mason said, his voice gruff. "Tell Sarah to prepare a pallet by the fire." Relief flooded Hannah's face as she scrambled to her feet and ran toward the cabin. Mason knelt beside the unconscious woman, noting the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but barely. In this cold, with these injuries, she wouldn't last another hour. As gently as his calloused hands allowed, Mason lifted the woman. She was lighter than he expected, her body hardened by deprivation. As he gathered her against his chest, he noticed she clutched something tightly in one hand. A small buckskin pouch, held with such determination that her fingers remained locked around it, even in unconsciousness. The wind howled around them as Mason carried the stranger toward the cabin. The snow was falling so heavily now that his tracks were filled almost as soon as he made them. By tomorrow, there would be no evidence that the woman had ever crossed his land, or so he hoped. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, her face a mask of concern and suspicion, as her father carried the unconscious woman into their home. "Who is she?" Sarah asked, closing the door against the biting wind. "Don't know," Mason answered, laying the stranger gently on the pallet Hannah had prepared near the hearth. "Apache, by the look of her, found her collapsed on the North Trail." Hannah was already bustling around, gathering clean cloths and the precious store of healing herbs they kept for emergencies. "She's so cold, Sarah, like ice." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line as she looked from her excited sister to her father. "Pa, this isn't safe. If she's running from something—" "I know the risks," Mason cut her off, his voice low. "We'll deal with them if they come. For now, we don't let someone freeze to death on our doorstep." He turned to Hannah. "Fetch hot water, but not too hot. We need to warm her slowly." As the girls moved to follow his instructions, Mason crouched beside the unconscious woman. Up close in the firelight, the extent of her injuries became clearer. Beyond the bruising and rope burns, there were methodical cuts along her arms, shallow but precise. The work of someone taking their time. Torture, not random violence. The buckskin pouch was still clutched in her hand. Mason considered prying her fingers open to examine it, then decided against it. Whatever she was protecting, with such determination even while unconscious, was her business. For now. Her clothes are soaked through, Sarah said, returning with a basin of water and clean cloths. We need to get her into something dry. Mason nodded, stepping back. You handle that. I'll check the barn once more before the storm worsens. Outside, the world had transformed into a swirling white void. Mason fought his way to the barn, secured the door more firmly, then stood in the relative shelter, watching the cabin through the curtain of snow. He'd brought danger into his home. He had no illusions about that. The woman's injuries told a story of pursuit and violence. Whoever had hurt her would be looking for her. But the storm offered protection too. No one would brave these conditions to track a fugitive, and by the time the weather cleared, all traces would be buried beneath feet of snow. It bought them time, at least. Mason pressed a hand against his side, feeling the pull of stitches where the grizzly had marked him. One predator after another. That was the way of these mountains. You survive one threat only to face the next. With a last look toward the cabin, he turned and forced his way back through the deepening snow, the wind cutting through his coat like knives. The woman regained consciousness as Sarah was washing the grime from her face. Her eyes flew open, dark, intense, immediately alert, and she tried to sit up, one hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Easy, Sarah said, keeping her voice calm, despite the spike of fear in her chest. You're safe here. The woman's gaze darted around the cabin, taking in Sarah, Hannah hovering nearby, the sturdy walls, the windows now covered with snow. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with warmth and the scent of pine. Where? The woman asked, her voice raspy from a cold and disuse. Reed cabin, Sarah answered. My father found you in the snow. You collapsed on our property. The woman's free hand went to her other, confirming that the buckskin pouch was still securely in her grasp. Only then did some of the tension leave her body. Water, she said. Hannah was already there with a cup. The woman drank deeply, then looked at the younger girl with something like surprise. Thank you, little one, she said, her English accented but clear. I'm Hannah, the girl replied with a smile. That's my sister Sarah. Our pa is Mason. He's outside checking the animals, but he'll be back soon. What's your name? Sarah shot her sister a warning look, but Hannah ignored it, her natural friendliness overcoming caution. The woman hesitated, studying Hannah's open face. Nova, she finally said. My name is Nova. That's pretty, Hannah said. Are you hungry? We have stew. Before Nova could answer, the door opened, bringing with it a blast of cold air and Mason Reed's imposing figure. He stomped snow from his boots, his gaze immediately finding the now conscious stranger by his hearth. Nova stiffened, her hand tightening around the pouch. You're awake, Mason said, removing his coat and hanging it by the door. Good. This is Nova, Pa, Hannah announced. She was just about to eat something. Mason crossed to the fire, keeping a respectful distance from their guest. You were nearly frozen when I found you, he said. Lucky you made it this far. Nova's eyes never left his face. Luck had no part in it, she said. The ancestors guided me. Mason raised an eyebrow but didn't challenge the statement. Those aren't injuries from the cold, he said instead, nodding toward her wrists. Someone did that to you. Sarah moved slightly closer to Hannah, her protective instincts flaring. Their father was being direct, perhaps too direct, but she understood why. They needed to know what or who might be following this woman to their door. Nova's expression revealed nothing. Yes, she said simply. Who? Mason pressed. Men who want what isn't theirs to take. Nova's gaze was steady, unflinching. Men who would kill for it. The cabin fell silent save for the crackling of the fire and the howl of wind outside. Mason studied the woman, weighing her words against the danger she might bring. The storm will last 2 days, maybe 3, he finally said. You can rest here until it passes. After that, we'll need to talk about where you're going. Relief flickered across Nova's face, quickly masked. Thank you, she said with formal dignity. I will not forget this kindness. Hannah beamed, already ladling stew into a bowl. Sarah remained watchful, caught between her sister's immediate acceptance and her father's cautious tolerance. Mason moved to the window, pulling back the edge of the covering to peer into the white oblivion beyond. The blizzard had arrived in full force, sealing them all inside together. A wounded Apache woman with secrets worth killing for, a man haunted by ghosts, and two girls caught in the middle of a story just beginning to unfold. That night, after his daughters had gone to bed upstairs, Mason sat at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle by lamplight. Nova lay on the pallet near the hearth, her breathing even in sleep. Or what appeared to be sleep. Mason wasn't convinced. "You can stop pretending," he said quietly, not looking up from his task. "I know you're awake." There was a moment of silence, then Nova shifted, pushing herself up to sitting. In the dim light, her face was a study in shadows and sharp angles. "You have good instincts," she said. "Necessary out here." Mason continued his methodical work on the rifle. "What are you running from? What makes you think I am running?" Mason looked up then, his expression flat. "People walk these mountains for three reasons. Because they live here, because they're passing through, or because they're running from something. You're not from around here, and no one passes through in winter." Nova watched him, weighing her response. "The men who did that," she gestured to her injuries, "they will not stop looking." Nova's hand went to the buckskin pouch that hadn't left her possession. "They believe I have something of value. Do you?" Value is not always what men like that believe it to be. Her eyes reflected the firelight, dark and fathomless. "What I carry has worth beyond gold, but only to my people." Mason set down the cleaning rod. "You're a long way from Apache territory." "My territory is ash now," Nova said, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "My family, my village, all gone. I am what remains." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, struck something in Mason. He knew what it was to be the one left behind, the one carrying the memory of what was lost. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Nova nodded once, accepting the sentiment. "Your daughters," she said after a moment, changing the subject. "They are strong spirits. The little one especially. She has the healer's gift." Mason tensed slightly. "Hannah is 10. She likes animals." "It is more than that." Nova's gaze was knowing. "I have seen it before. The way she touches with intent, the way she observes. She sees beyond the surface." Mason didn't respond. He'd noticed Hannah's unusual abilities with injured creatures, her intuitive understanding of what ailed them. It reminded him too much of Elena, who'd had the same gift, the gift that had drawn her to nursing during the war, where they'd first met. "The storm will pass," Mason said, returning to his rifle. "When it does, you should be ready to move on." Nova studied him for a long moment. "You fear for them," she said. "Your daughters." "Any father would." "No." Nova shook her head. "It is more. You carry loss like a stone in your chest. You believe danger follows all who come near you." Mason's hand stilled on the rifle. The woman's perception unsettled him. "You don't know me," he said, his voice hardening. "I know grief," Nova replied simply. "I know how it turns a person into a fortress. Strong walls, no doors." She paused. "But fortresses become prisons. In time." Mason stood abruptly. "Get some rest," he said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "You'll need your strength when the storm breaks." He moved to the window, pulling aside the covering just enough to see the swirling snow illuminated by moonlight. Behind him, he heard Nova settling back onto her pallet, the fire popping and hissing in the hearth. Her words echoed in his mind. Fortresses become prisons in time. It was too close to what Elena had once said to him after the war, when nightmares still jolted him awake most nights. "The walls you build to keep pain out also keep life from getting in." Outside, the blizzard raged, bending pine trees nearly double with its force. Inside, in the quiet cabin, Mason Reed stood watch as he always did, guarding against dangers both real and remembered. But for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his solitude as something chosen rather than imposed. A fortress of his own construction that had indeed become a prison. Behind him, Nova watched through half-closed eyes, reading the tension in the man's broad shoulders, the sorrow etched into the lines of his face. She clutched the buckskin pouch tighter, feeling the hard edges of what it contained, the last hope of her people, a burden and a promise she had carried through blood and snow to this strange sanctuary in the mountains. The storm would end, as all storms must. What lay beyond it remained to be seen. Dawn broke pale and diffused through the snow-covered windows. The blizzard had continued unabated through the night, transforming the world outside into an unrecognizable landscape of white drifts and buried landmarks. Inside the cabin, Sarah kindled the fire to new life, moving quietly so as not to wake the others. She glanced at Nova, who slept curled on her side near the hearth, the buckskin pouch still clutched protectively in one hand. In sleep, the woman's face was softer, the wariness momentarily absent. Sarah could see now that she was younger than she'd first appeared, perhaps only in her late 20s, though hardship had carved premature lines around her eyes and mouth. "Is she still sleeping?" Hannah whispered, appearing at the bottom of the stairs. Sarah nodded, putting a finger to her lips. Hannah tiptoed across the room to join her sister, peering down at their unexpected guest with undisguised curiosity. "Pa said she was Apache," Hannah murmured. "Do you think she knows how to make the healing balms they're famous for?" "Mrs. Thornton at school said Apache medicine can cure almost anything." "Mrs. Thornton talks too much," Sarah replied. "And don't pester Nova with questions when she wakes. She's been through something terrible." Hannah's expression sobered. "I saw the marks on her arms. Who would do something like that?" Before Sarah could answer, Nova's eyes opened, alert and focused despite her recent sleep. She sat up smoothly, her gaze taking in the sisters standing nearby. "Good morning," she said, her voice clearer than it had been the previous day. "Good morning," Hannah replied cheerfully. "Are you hungry? Sarah makes the best Johnny cakes in the whole territory." A faint smile touched Nova's lips. "I would be grateful for food, yes." As Sarah moved to the stove, Hannah settled cross-legged on the floor near Nova's pallet, apparently forgetting her sister's warning about questions. "Is it true that Apache people know special medicine? Because our calf was hurt by a bear, and Pa said it might not make it, but I've been trying to help it, and I thought maybe you might know something that could make it stronger." Nova studied the girl's earnest face. "Your people have their medicine, and mine have ours. Both have power." She paused. "I would need to see the calf to know what might help." Hannah's face lit up. "He's in the lean-to off the kitchen. I named him Patch because he has a white patch on his forehead. Can you come see him now?" "Hannah," Sarah warned from the stove, "Nova is still recovering herself." "It's all right," Nova said, carefully rising to her feet. She swayed slightly, then steadied herself. "I would like to see this calf." Hannah led the way to the small extension off the kitchen where the orphaned calf lay on a bed of straw. The animal raised its head as they entered, its large eyes fixing on Hannah with what looked remarkably like affection. "See," Hannah said proudly, "he knows me now, but he still won't eat much, and he shivers even though I keep him warm." Nova knelt beside the calf, her movements slow and deliberate. She ran her hands gently over the animal's body, pausing at its rib cage, then examining its eyes and mouth. "This one has fear in his bones," she said. "He saw death take his mother. The body can heal, but the spirit must also be mended." Hannah nodded solemnly as if this made perfect sense to her. "How do we help his spirit?" Nova studied Hannah for a moment, then reached for her ever-present pouch. Opening it carefully, she withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. Unfolding the covering, she revealed a smooth piece of quartz crystal, clear as water with veins of gold running through it. "In my tribe, we use sacred stones to draw out fear and pain," Nova explained. "This one has been in my family for generations." She placed the crystal against the calf's chest, holding it there while murmuring words in Apache that sounded to Hannah like the rustling of leaves in wind. After a few moments, she returned the crystal to its wrapping and placed it back in her pouch. "Now we make medicine for his body," Nova said. "Do you have sage, honey, pine needles from a young tree?" Hannah nodded eagerly. "Sarah keeps sage and honey for tea when we're sick, and I can get pine needles from the tree by the porch." "The storm," Sarah began, appearing in the doorway with a concerned expression. "The pine branches hang over the porch rail," Hannah explained. "I don't have to go into the snow at all." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Be quick about it." As Hannah darted away, Sarah regarded Nova with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "You really think you can help the calf?" "I have treated many animals," Nova replied. "But more importantly, I am helping your sister. She has a healer's heart. I can show her how to use it." Something in Sarah softened slightly. Anyone who recognized Hannah's special gifts couldn't be all bad. Our mother was a healer, she said quietly. She was a nurse in the war, then helped people around here until she trailed off. Until she crossed to the spirit world, Nova finished gently. Sarah nodded. Hannah was just a baby. She doesn't remember, but sometimes she does things exactly like Mom would have done. A look of understanding passed between the two women, one barely out of girlhood, the other weathered by experiences no one should have to endure. In that moment, a fragile thread of connection formed. Hannah burst back into the lean-to, clutching a handful of fresh pine needles. Got them. What do we do now? Nova smiled, the expression transforming her solemn face. Now, little healer, we make medicine. Mason found them there an hour later when he came in from checking the property. The storm had eased slightly, allowing him to assess the damage. A section of fence buried completely, the woodpile nearly invisible under a drift, but the structures intact. He stomped snow from his boots and followed the sound of Hannah's excited chatter to the lean-to. The scene that greeted him stopped him in the doorway. Hannah and Nova knelt beside the calf, applying a green-tinged salve to its chest. The animal, which had been listless since Mason had brought it home, was now alert, even attempting to stand on wobbling legs. Sarah stood nearby, holding a bowl that contained more of the medicine. "Pa," Hannah exclaimed, "Nova made special medicine, and it's working. Patch is getting better." Mason's gaze moved to Nova, who met his eyes steadily. There was color in her cheeks now, and though the bruises were still visible, she moved with more confidence than the day before. "He had water in his lungs," Nova explained. "The salve helps him breathe easier and fight the sickness that was growing there." Mason nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, the words awkward in his mouth from disuse. Nova inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Your daughter did most of the work. She has the gift." Hannah beamed at the praise. Even Sarah looked pleased, the usual wariness in her expression softened. "The storm's letting up," Mason said, "but the snow's deep. No one's traveling for at least another day." "Then I will help more," Nova said, "to repay your kindness." Mason didn't argue. He'd seen enough of Nova now to know she wasn't the type to accept charity. Neither was he. Throughout the day, Nova worked alongside Sarah and Hannah, preparing a stew with herbs that filled the cabin with unfamiliar but enticing aromas, mending a tear in one of Mason's shirts with neat, nearly invisible stitches, and continuing to treat the calf, which improved visibly by the hour. Mason kept his distance, observing. The woman moved with a quiet efficiency that reminded him of Elena. No wasted motions, no unnecessary words. But there was something else about her, something he couldn't quite define. A vigilance beneath the calm exterior, as if she was always listening for something beyond human hearing. That evening after dinner, Hannah convinced Nova to tell them a story from her people. They gathered by the fire, the howling wind outside making the warmth within that much more precious. "My grandmother told this story on nights when the wind spoke loudly, like tonight," Nova began, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality. "In the beginning, all the world was dark. The animals could not see to hunt. The plants could not grow. The people wandered lost. Then Raven, the trickster, heard of a chief in the sky world who kept the sun, the moon, and the stars in carved boxes in his lodge. Mason sat slightly apart, whittling a piece of pine into the shape of a horse, a gift for Hannah's upcoming birthday. But as Nova's story unfolded, he found his hands going still, his attention caught by the ancient tale and the skillful way she told it. Hannah sat entranced, her eyes wide with wonder. Even Sarah, who tried so hard to appear grown-up and unimpressed, leaned forward, caught in the spell of the narrative. "And that is why the sun travels across the sky each day," Nova concluded, "because Raven, though selfish in his intentions, brought light to all the world." Hannah sighed contentedly. "That was wonderful. Do you know more stories?" "Many," Nova said with a smile, "but perhaps another night." Sarah rose, practical as always. "Time for bed, Hannah. It's late." Hannah reluctantly stood, then impulsively hugged Nova. "Thank you for the story and for helping Patch." Nova looked startled by the affectionate gesture, then carefully returned the embrace. "Sleep well, little healer." As Sarah ushered her sister upstairs, Mason set aside his carving. He and Nova were alone by the fire for the first time since their late-night conversation. "Your daughters are treasures," Nova said softly. "The elder carries too much responsibility, but her spirit is strong, and the younger one, she has rare gifts." Mason nodded. "Sarah had to grow up too fast after Elena, their mother, died. I wasn't, I wasn't what they needed." The admission surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Nova. He wasn't one for personal revelations, especially to strangers. "Grief changes the path we walk," Nova said. "Sometimes it leads us into shadowlands where we cannot find ourselves for many seasons." "You sound like you speak from experience." Nova's hand went to the buckskin pouch at her waist, a gesture Mason had noticed she made often, as if reassuring herself it was still there. "My entire tribe was massacred 3 moons ago," she said, her voice steady despite the horror of her words. "I was away, gathering medicine plants in the high country. When I returned, there was nothing but ash and death." Mason felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said again, the words still inadequate. Nova opened the pouch, withdrawing several items which she laid carefully on the floor between them. The crystal she had used earlier with the calf, a small carved wooden figure of a bear, a piece of what looked like quartz with strange markings etched into its surface, and finally a folded piece of hide with faded markings. "These are all that remain of my people," she said. "Our sacred objects, our story keeper's map." Mason leaned forward slightly, his attention caught by the marked stone. The pattern seemed oddly familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen something similar. "The men who hunt me," Nova continued, "they seek this." She pointed to the marked stone. "They believe it leads to a place of power, a sacred site where gold lies beneath the earth." "Does it?" Mason asked. "Not in the way they think." Nova's expression was solemn. "The place is sacred because it holds the spirits of my ancestors, not because of metal that white men value." She picked up the stone, turning it in her hands. "This is the key to finding the site. Without it, the map is useless. The man who leads them, he calls himself Blackwell. He tortured our shaman for days trying to make him reveal its location. When he would not speak, they killed everyone, believing the secret died with them." "But you survived," Mason said, "and you have the stone." Nova nodded. "I am the last keeper of my people's sacred trust. I must protect these things until I can bring them to our sister tribe in the south. There, perhaps, some part of our ways can survive." Mason's gaze was drawn again to the marked stone. "Those symbols," he began, then stopped, a memory surfacing from long ago, a similar pattern, inked into flesh. Without conscious thought, Mason rolled up his left sleeve, revealing a faded tattoo on his forearm. The design wasn't identical to the marks on the stone, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Curved lines intersecting with sharp angles, forming a pattern that suggested mountains and rivers. Nova's eyes widened. "Where did you get this mark?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason stared at his own arm as if seeing the tattoo for the first time in years. "I was a boy," he said slowly. "My parents were killed by raiders on the frontier. I was found, half-starved, by an old woman, an Apache woman. She took me in, cared for me for almost a year. She gave me this mark before I was taken to an orphanage, said it would protect me." Nova studied the mark carefully. "This symbol is sacred to my people," she said simply. "It is rare to see it on someone not of Apache blood." Mason withdrew his arm, rolling his sleeve down. "It's just a remnant of a time I barely remember," he said gruffly. Nova gathered her sacred objects, returning them to the pouch, her expression thoughtful, but she offered no further explanation. The fire crackled between them, shadows dancing on the walls of the cabin. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but with diminished fury. By morning, it would be spent. "You should rest," Mason said, rising to his feet. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Nova nodded, settling back onto her pallet, but her eyes followed Mason as he checked the doors and windows, banked the fire for the night. The mark on his arm had shaken her more than she revealed. It was a sign she had not expected to find in this remote cabin, on this strange man with sorrowful eyes. As Mason climbed the stairs to look in on his daughters before seeking his own bed, Nova whispered a prayer of gratitude to her ancestors for guiding her footsteps to this place. Whatever trials lay ahead, she was no longer alone in facing them. The prophecy was unfolding, whether Mason Reed believed it or not. Sarah couldn't sleep. The stranger's story of massacre and pursuit kept playing in her mind, along with the strange coincidence of her father's tattoo. She'd seen it before, of course, a faded blue design he never explained and she never asked about. But now it seemed significant in ways she couldn't articulate. She slipped from bed, careful not to wake Hannah, and moved to the small window. The snow had stopped falling, and moonlight reflected blindingly off the transformed landscape. In that silvery illumination, she could see that the world had been reborn. Familiar landmarks buried, new contours formed by wind-sculpted drifts. A movement caught her eye, her father, standing on the porch below. He wasn't wearing a coat despite the bitter cold, his breath forming clouds around his head. His face was tilted upward, toward the stars, in an attitude Sarah recognized from countless nights when sleep eluded him. He was speaking to her mother again, in the silent communion he'd maintained since Elena's death. Sarah had never interrupted these moments, feeling they were too private, too sacred for intrusion. But tonight, something made her linger at the window, watching. Her father's shoulders were tense, his hands clenched at his sides. This wasn't the peaceful, sorrowful communion she was accustomed to observing. He looked troubled, conflicted. Nova's arrival had disturbed something in him. Sarah wasn't sure if that was good or dangerous. For 10 years, their life had followed predictable patterns. Her father's grief, a constant, unchanging presence around which they all orbited. The idea of that changing both thrilled and terrified her. Sarah touched the locket at her throat, the one containing a small portrait of the mother she remembered only in fragments. A gentle laugh, the scent of lavender, hands that were never too busy to offer comfort. "What would you want him to do, Mom?" she whispered to the night. "What would you want for all of us?" No answer came, of course, but as she watched, her father's posture gradually relaxed, his hands unclenching. Whatever internal battle he was fighting, some resolution seemed to have been reached. Sarah returned to bed, her thoughts churning with possibilities. Tomorrow, when the storm had fully passed, decisions would have to be made. About Nova, about the dangers pursuing her, about the strange connection between her sacred stone and her father's mysterious tattoo. For the first time in years, Sarah fell asleep wondering not about what needed to be done tomorrow, but about what might happen, what unexpected turn their carefully ordered life might take. It was both frightening and somehow exhilarating. Morning brought a world transformed. The storm had spent itself during the night, leaving behind a pristine landscape of untouched white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of trees. The sky arched overhead, a perfect blue dome unmarked by clouds. In the crystalline air, distant mountains seemed close enough to touch. Mason stood in the yard, assessing the damage and the work ahead. The snow reached almost to his knees in the cleared area near the house. In the drifts, it was waist-high or deeper. The barn had weathered the storm well, though icicles hung like crystal daggers from its eaves. The animals would need tending, paths would need clearing, and the routine of life would resume. But first there was the matter of their guest. He turned as the cabin door opened. Nova stepped out, wrapped in one of Elena's old shawls that Sarah must have given her. She paused on the porch, her face lifting toward the sun, eyes closing briefly as she absorbed its warmth. "Your land is beautiful," she said without opening her eyes. "It's harsh," Mason replied. "Beautiful only to those who know how to survive it." Nova looked at him then. "Like you." It wasn't a question. "I manage." Mason turned back to surveying the property. "The main trail will be impassable for at least 3 days. Even then, traveling alone would be dangerous. Yet you expect me to leave." Again, not a question. Mason sighed, his breath clouding in the cold air. "The men hunting you won't stop because of a snowstorm. They'll come when they can. I have my daughters to think of." Nova descended the porch steps, moving carefully through the snow to stand beside him. "The mark on your arm," Nova said quietly. "It has meaning among my people." "It's just a tattoo," Mason said, discomfort evident in his voice. "Perhaps," Nova replied, "but it is strange that, of all places, the storm brought me here, to someone who bears it." Mason turned to face her fully. What exactly are you suggesting? Only that some meetings are not by chance, she said simply. I'm no savior, Mason said bluntly. I'm just a man trying to raise his daughters and keep them safe. Perhaps those two purposes are not separate, Nova replied. The men who hunt me, led by Ezra Blackwell, they are dangerous not just to me, but to all who stand in their way. If they track me here, your daughters will be in danger whether you have helped me or sent me away. Mason's jaw tightened. The woman's logic was sound, much as he wished to deny it. If Blackwell was as ruthless as Nova described, he wouldn't hesitate to harm anyone he suspected of aiding his quarry. Tell me more about this Blackwell, he said. What exactly does he want? Power, Nova answered simply. He believes the sacred site marked on our keeper's map contains gold, but it holds something far more valuable. A place where the veil between worlds is thin, where one can speak with ancestors. See visions of what may come. She touched the pouch at her waist. The stone I carry is the key to finding this place. Without it, the map is meaningless. Mason considered this information. How many men ride with him? When they came to my village, there were 7. They may have gained more since, and they were willing to kill for this vision quest site. Nova's expression darkened. They killed everyone in my village. Elders, women, children. They would have killed me too if I'd been there. The cold certainly in her voice left no room for doubt. Mason rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the stubble of several days' growth. The situation was more complicated than he'd initially thought. Not only was Nova bringing danger to his door, but she was also entangled in something that touched on his own mysterious past. The old Apache woman who had saved him, the tattoo she had given him. I need time to think, he said finally. In the meantime, you'll stay here. We'll watch for signs of pursuit. Relief showed briefly on Nova's face before she composed it back into its usual calm mask. Thank you, she said with simple dignity. The cabin door opened again, and Hannah bounded out, wrapped in a coat too big for her small frame. Nova, look at all the snow, isn't it beautiful? Sarah followed more sedately, carrying a basket. Hannah, don't run. You'll fall and break your neck in this snow. Mason watched as Hannah grabbed Nova's hand, chattering excitedly about showing her how to make snow angels. The Apache woman smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her solemn face, and allowed herself to be led a few yards away from the cabin. Pa, Sarah said quietly, coming to stand beside him. Sheriff Colton might come to check on us after the storm. What will you tell him about her? Mason hadn't considered this complication. Robert Colton had been his commanding officer during the war, and later his friend, until the incident at Fort Gibson that had driven a wedge between them. Now, as sheriff of Shadow Creek Lake, Colton represented both the law Mason generally respected and the painful past he tried to forget. The truth, I suppose, Mason said, that she was caught in a storm and we took her in. Sarah gave him a skeptical look. And when he asked why she was in these mountains in winter, alone and injured, Mason had no answer for that. Sarah was right to be concerned. Colton was no fool, and he knew Mason well enough to sense when he was hiding something. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, he said finally. Sarah studied her father's face for a moment, then nodded, accepting his decision even if she didn't fully agree with it. It was a gesture that made Mason's heart ache. His daughter had learned too young to shoulder adult concerns, to accept difficult situations without complaint. I'm going to check on Patch, Sarah said, turning toward the lean-to. He seems much better after Nova's treatment. As she walked away, Mason watched Hannah showing Nova how to fall backward into the snow and sweep her arms to create an angel shape. The Apache woman followed the child's instructions with good-natured tolerance, then lay looking up at the sky, an expression of peaceful wonder on her face that made her seem suddenly younger, unburdened. Mason felt something stir in his chest, a tightening, an ache, a sensation he couldn't immediately identify. When he did recognize it, the realization was unsettling. It was longing. Later that morning, Mason was in the barn repairing a broken stall door when he heard the distinctive crunch of footsteps in snow. He tensed, reaching for the rifle he kept leaning against the wall, before recognizing Sarah's light tread. Pa, she said from the barn entrance, Nova's showing me how to make the medicine for Patch, but we need more pine resin. Is it safe to go to the grove by the creek? Mason considered. The pine grove was only a quarter-mile from the cabin, and the path, while snow-covered, was relatively flat and free of hazards. "Take your rifle," he said. "Stay alert." Sarah nodded, turning to go, then hesitated. "Pa? That mark on your arm, the one Nova recognized. You've never told us where it came from." Mason set down his tools, giving his full attention to his daughter. "There wasn't much to tell, or so I thought." He explained briefly what he'd told Nova about being orphaned, about the Apache woman who had taken him in, about the tattoo she had given him before he was taken to the orphanage. "So, you lived with the Apache?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with surprise. "You never said anything." "It was a long time ago. I was very young. I barely remember it." Mason rolled his sleeve back down. "It didn't seem important. But Nova thinks it is. She thinks it means something." "Nova sees connections where there might be none," Mason said, but without conviction. The coincidence of their meeting was indeed strange. A lone Apache woman with a sacred mission stumbling upon the very cabin where lived a man marked with her tribe's symbol of protection. Sarah seemed to sense his uncertainty. "What if she's right, Pa? What if you were meant to help her?" "I don't believe in destiny," Mason said firmly. "We make our own choices, for good or ill. Like your choice to shut yourself away after Mom died." The words were out before Sarah could stop them. She looked immediately contrite. "I'm sorry, Pa. I didn't mean—" "No," Mason interrupted, his voice gentle. "You're right to call me out. I haven't been what you girls needed, not really." Sarah's expression softened. "You kept us safe, fed, sheltered. That's something." "It's the minimum," Mason replied. "Your mother would have wanted more for you, for all of us." A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken grief and regret. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice quiet. "I think Mom would want you to help Nova. She never turned away anyone in need." Mason nodded slowly. "No, she didn't." He paused. "Be careful at the pine grove. Take Hannah with you. She needs to run off some energy and be back before midday." Sarah gave him a small smile, recognizing both the concern and trust in his instructions. "We will. And Pa, thank you." After she left, Mason returned to his repair work, but his mind was elsewhere. Sarah's words had stirred memories of Elena, her boundless compassion, her unwavering belief that helping others was never optional, but always essential. She would indeed have taken Nova in without hesitation, would have treated her injuries, would have listened to her story with an open heart. And what would Elena make of the strange connection between Mason's long-forgotten tattoo and Nova's sacred mission? She had always been more open to mysteries than he was, more willing to see pattern and purpose where he saw only random chance. Mason's hand stilled on the wood he was nailing. For 10 years, he had tried to honor Elena's memory by protecting their daughters, by ensuring they had food and shelter and safety. But perhaps he had been honoring only the practical aspects of who she had been, neglecting the spiritual, the compassionate, the brave. Perhaps, in trying to keep her memory alive, he had instead betrayed the very essence of who she had been. The revelation was uncomfortable, even painful. But like a dislocated joint being reset, the pain came with a sense of rightness, of something long out of alignment finally moving back into its proper place. Mason set down his hammer and stepped outside the barn. The sun was high now, turning the snow into a dazzling carpet of diamonds. From the direction of the cabin, he could hear Hannah's laughter, a sound too rarely heard in recent years. Whatever danger Nova brought with her, whatever ancient prophecy might or might not be unfolding, one thing was becoming clear to Mason Reed. The fortress he had built around himself and his daughters was crumbling, stone by stone. And part of him, the part that remembered what it was to truly live, didn't want to rebuild those walls. The town of Shadow Creek lay nestled in a valley 3 miles from Mason's property. Small but prosperous due to the mining operations in the surrounding mountains, it boasted a main street with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and the sheriff's office. Today, 3 days after the blizzard, the town was gradually emerging from beneath its blanket of snow. Men with shovels cleared paths along the boardwalks, and smoke rose from every chimney against the clear blue sky. Sheriff Robert Colton stood in front of his office, watching the town come back to life. At 47, Colton was still a commanding presence. tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard and eyes that missed little. The silver star on his chest caught the morning light as he surveyed the street. "Morning, Sheriff," called Jacob Miller, the town doctor, as he made his way through the snow. "Doc," Colton nodded. "Anyone in need of your services after the storm?" "Just the usual. Mrs. Harper's rheumatism acting up. Young Timothy Wilson with a broken arm from sledding. Nothing serious." The doctor paused. "I was thinking of riding out to check on the outlying homesteads. The Reed place is furthest out. Thought I might start there." Colton's expression sharpened with interest. "I've been considering the same. Mason's girls don't get into town much, especially in winter." "My thoughts exactly," Miller agreed. "Though Mason doesn't generally welcome visitors." "No," Colton said thoughtfully, "he doesn't. But a wellness check after a storm like that one, he can't rightly turn that away." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of riders at the far end of the street, 3 men on horseback moving slowly through the deep snow. Even at a distance, Colton could tell they weren't locals. There was something in their bearing, in the deliberate way they surveyed the buildings as they approached, that put his instincts on alert. "Excuse me, Doc," he said, stepping down from the boardwalk. "Looks like we have visitors." As the riders drew closer, Colton took their measure. The leader rode a sleek black stallion and wore clothing too fine for the frontier, a wool coat with fur trim, polished boots, a hat that probably cost more than most men in Shadow Creek earned in a month. His companions were clearly hired muscle, hard-faced men with well-worn guns at their hips. "Good morning, gentlemen," Colton called as they reached him. "Welcome to Shadow Creek." The well-dressed man smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Sheriff," he acknowledged, noting Colton's badge. "Ezra Blackwell, at your service." He gestured to his companions. "My associates, Mr. Holt and Mr. Vance." "What brings you to our town, Mr. Blackwell? Business or pleasure?" "A bit of both, perhaps." Blackwell dismounted gracefully despite the snow, handing his reins to one of his men. "I find myself in pursuit of some lost property, an Apache woman who took something of great value from me." Colton kept his expression neutral, but his interest was immediately piqued. An Apache woman in these parts would be unusual enough to note, and Mason Reed's property lay in the direction from which the storm had blown in. "Haven't seen any Apache folk around here," Colton said carefully. "Most stay far to the south or west of here." "Yes, generally they do." Blackwell brushed snow from his coat sleeves with gloved hands. "But this one is running, and desperate people often end up in unexpected places. She may have sought shelter during the blizzard." "That storm would have killed anyone caught in the open," Colton observed. "Apache or not." "Indeed." Blackwell's smile thinned. "Which is why I'm inquiring about homesteads or cabins in the area where she might have found refuge. She's quite persuasive. Might have convinced someone to take her in." Colton didn't like the implication in Blackwell's tone, nor the cold calculation in his eyes. "Folks around here are decent. If someone was near death in that storm, most would offer shelter." Of course, of course," Blackwell made a dismissive gesture. "I meant no offense. I'm simply eager to recover what was stolen." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "I've taken the liberty of having a likeness drawn. Perhaps you might recognize her, or show it to your deputies." Colton accepted the paper and unfolded it. The drawing was crude but effective. A woman with high cheekbones and long, straight hair. Her eyes, even in the rough sketch, held a proud defiance. "What exactly did she steal from you, Mr. Blackwell?" Colton asked, looking up from the drawing. "A family heirloom, a small stone with markings of great sentimental value." Blackwell's expression remained pleasant, but something hardened in his voice. "Along with some maps that are crucial to my business interests." "And what business would that be?" "Mining, primarily. I have operations in Colorado and Nevada. I'm looking to expand into this territory." Colton refolded the paper, considering his response. His instincts, honed by years of war and law enforcement, were sending clear warnings about this man. But without cause, he had no reason to be anything but professionally helpful. "I'll keep an eye out," he said, handing the drawing back. "But as I said, no Apache have been reported in town." "What about outside of town?" Blackwell pressed. "Any isolated properties where she might have sought shelter?" Colton hesitated. Mason Reed's place was the most likely candidate. remote with a direct path from Apache territory if one knew the mountain trails. But something held him back from mentioning it. Old loyalties, perhaps, or simply caution in the face of a man he instinctively distrusted. There are several homesteads scattered through the valley, he said noncommittally. I plan to check on them anyway after the storm. I'll inquire then. Blackwell studied him for a moment, as if sensing the deliberate omission. I'd be most grateful, he said finally. In fact, I'd be happy to compensate you for any information that leads to the recovery of my property. Say $500. The sum was substantial, more than Colton earned in 6 months as sheriff. That Blackwell would offer it so casually spoke volumes about both his wealth and his desperation. That won't be necessary, Colton said evenly. Just doing my job. The Silver Buck Saloon has rooms available if you're planning to stay in town. Most kind of you, Sheriff. Blackwell nodded, turning back to his horse. We'll be in touch. As the three men moved down the street toward the saloon, Dr. Miller approached again. What was that about? He asked. Nothing good, Colton replied grimly. Change of plans, Doc. I'll ride out to the Reed place alone. The sooner the better. Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching as Nova worked with Hannah in the yard. The snow had melted enough in places to reveal patches of earth, and Nova was showing Hannah how to identify plants that remain green even in winter. Small, hardy herbs that could be used for medicine or flavoring. The past 3 days had seen Nova's integration into their household routine with surprising ease. She helped with cooking and cleaning, continued to care for the now recovering calf, and spent hours teaching Hannah about plants, stars, and Apache stories. Even Sarah, initially wary, had found herself drawn to the quiet strength and gentle wisdom of their visitor. Most surprising was the change in her father. He still spent hours alone, still spoke little, but there was a subtle difference in his demeanor. He watched Nova when he thought no one was looking, with an expression Sarah couldn't quite decipher. Not merely suspicion or assessment, but something more complex. And he had joined them at the dinner table for every meal, occasionally even contributing to the conversation. Last night he had even laughed, a rusty, unpracticed sound, at a story Hannah told about the calf's antics. The sound had frozen them all in momentary shock before Hannah had continued, her face glowing with pleasure at having elicited such a rare response from her father. Movement at the edge of the cleared yard caught Sarah's attention. A rider was approaching, a familiar figure on a dappled gray horse. Sheriff Colton. Sarah's heart sank. His arrival could only complicate their already precarious situation. She hurried to the door. "Pa," she called. "Sheriff Colton's coming." Mason emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw the approaching rider and his expression tightened. Then he turned toward Hannah and Nova. "Sarah," he said quietly, "get Nova inside. Take her to the root cellar. Quickly, without fuss." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. "Hannah," she called, "come help me with dinner." Hannah looked up, disappointed at the interruption of her lesson. "But Nova is showing me—" "Now, Hannah," Sarah insisted, her tone brooking no argument. Nova had already understood the situation. She gathered her herbs into a small bundle and followed Hannah toward the house. As they reached the porch, Mason intercepted them. "Sheriff's coming," he said to Nova in a low voice. "Best if he doesn't see you. Sarah will show you where to hide." Nova met his gaze, her dark eyes steady. "You trust this sheriff?" "I trust him to do his job," Mason replied, "which might include looking for you depending on who's been asking questions in town." Nova nodded once, then followed Sarah into the house. Hannah, belatedly realizing the seriousness of the situation, hurried after them without further protest. Mason returned to the yard, positioning himself to greet the approaching rider. His relationship with Robert Colton was complicated by shared history, both the camaraderie of men who had fought side by side and the bitter division of those who had ultimately chosen different paths. They had once been friends, as close as brothers. Now they were cautious acquaintances, bound by memories neither wished to revisit. "Robert," Mason called as the sheriff drew near. "What brings you out this way?" Colton reined in his horse, studying Mason with shrewd eyes. "Checking on outlying properties after the storm," he said, dismounting. "You and the girls weather it all right?" "Well enough. Some fence damage, but the structure's held." Mason gestured toward the house. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Colton nodded, removing his hat as they moved toward the porch. "Appreciate it. Cold ride out here." Inside, Mason poured coffee into 2 tin cups while Colton warmed himself by the fire. Sarah busied herself at the stove, her posture slightly too rigid to be natural. Hannah was nowhere to be seen, presumably still with Nova in the root cellar. "Girls doing all right?" Colton asked, accepting the coffee. "Haven't seen them in town in a while." "They're fine," Mason replied. "Sarah's keeping up with her studies. Hannah's got away with animals. She's nursing an orphaned calf right now." "Good, good." Colton sipped his coffee, then set the cup down. "Mason, I'm not just here for a social call." "Figured as much. Had some strangers come into town this morning, looking for an Apache woman they claim stole from them." Colton watched Mason's face carefully. "Said she might have sought shelter during the storm." Mason's expression remained impassive. "Lots of places she could have gone. Not many where she'd be welcomed," Colton countered. "You're on the direct path from the south, and I know you were married to a half-Cherokee woman once. Thought you might be more sympathetic than most." The mention of Elena's heritage, something Mason rarely discussed, was calculated to provoke a reaction. Mason gave none, but Sarah's hands stilled momentarily at the stove before resuming their work. "Haven't seen any Apache," Mason said evenly. "Storm kept us all indoors for 3 days." Colton studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "The man looking for her calls himself Ezra Blackwell. Wealthy type, mining interests, offering a substantial reward. Must be valuable, whatever she took. According to him, it's a family heirloom, a marked stone and some maps." Colton leaned forward. "But I don't trust him, Mason. There's something off about the whole story." A floorboard creaked overhead, Hannah moving around in the loft most likely. Mason used the momentary distraction to consider his response. "Why are you telling me this, Robert?" he finally asked. "If you think I'm harboring a fugitive, you could just search the place." "I could," Colton agreed. "But I'm not here as the sheriff right now. I'm here as the man who served with you at Shiloh, as the man who carried you off that field at Fort Gibson when you were more dead than alive." He paused. "I'm here as someone who once called you friend before things went sour between us." The reference to their shared past hung in the air between them. Mason looked away, unwilling to meet Colton's gaze. "If you know anything about this woman, or if you come across her," Colton continued, "be careful. Blackwell didn't come alone. He's got 2 hard cases with him who look like they'd shoot their own mothers for $1. "Noted," Mason said. "Anything else you need to tell me in your unofficial capacity?" Colton stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Just that Blackwell plans to start checking the outlying properties himself if he doesn't get results soon. I can delay him a day, maybe 2, but that's all." "Understood." As Mason walked Colton back to his horse, the sheriff paused, looking out over the property with an assessing eye. "You've done well here, Mason. Built something solid. Would hate to see it jeopardized." "So would I," Mason replied. Colton mounted his horse, gathering the reins. "One more thing. Blackwell mentioned the Apache woman might be injured. Said she'd been difficult when they tried to recover their property." His expression hardened. Based on his tone, I'd say that's an understatement. Mason nodded, understanding the implied message. Blackwell had hurt Nova badly and would likely do worse if he found her. "Take care, Robert," he said. "Bad weather for riding. Trails treacherous in places." "Always is," Colton replied with a slight smile, before turning his horse and riding back toward town. Mason watched until he disappeared around the bend in the trail, then returned to the house. Sarah was already opening the trap door to the root cellar, where Nova and Hannah emerged, the latter looking excited by the adventure of hiding. "Was that your friend the sheriff?" Hannah asked. "Why did we have to hide Nova from him?" "Because the men looking for Nova have reached town," Mason explained, his gaze moving to Nova's solemn face. "A man named Blackwell is offering rewards for information about you." Nova's expression didn't change, but her hand went to the pouch at her waist in the now familiar protective gesture. "This Blackwell, is he staying in town?" "For now, but according to Colton, he won't wait long before searching the surrounding properties himself." "Then I must leave," Nova said decisively. "Tonight, under cover of darkness. I've brought enough danger to your family already." "No," Hannah cried, clutching Nova's arm. "You can't go. They'll hurt you again." Nova knelt to the child's level, her expression gentle. "Little healer, Sometimes the brave thing to do is to protect those we care about, even if it means facing danger ourselves. You won't make it 10 miles in this snow, Sarah interjected, surprising Mason with her vehemence. Not alone, not at night. Your sister is right, Mason said. Leaving now would be suicide. He moved to the window looking out toward the mountains. But staying isn't safe either, not with Blackwell searching. We need a better plan. What do you suggest? Nova asked. Mason turned back to face them, his decision made. The fortress walls he had maintained for so long had indeed crumbled, and in their place stood something he had thought lost forever. Purpose, Upam. We need to get you to safety, not just temporary hiding, but somewhere Blackwell can't reach you. He paused. I know these mountains better than anyone. There's a place, a hidden valley beyond the high ridge. It's accessible only by a trail few know about. We could reach it in 2 days. The three of us? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the enormity of what her father was proposing. Mason nodded. Pack only what we can farm. We leave at first light. As the implications of this decision settled over them, Mason caught Nova watching him with an unreadable expression. When their eyes met, she inclined her head slightly, a gesture of respect and gratitude that needed no words. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long blue shadows across the snow. In town, Ezra Blackwell would be planning his own move. The pieces were in motion now, the confrontation inevitable. Mason only hoped he had made the right choice, not just for Nova, but for his daughters and for himself. For the first time in 10 years, Mason Reed was choosing to move toward danger rather than away from it. And strangely, it felt like waking from a long, dreamless sleep. Dawn had barely begun to color the eastern sky when Mason completed the final preparations. 4 packs lay by the door, each carefully filled with only the essentials: food, extra clothing, medical supplies, ammunition. The weight had to be manageable for a journey through deep snow, over difficult terrain. Sarah moved quietly around the kitchen, wrapping cornbread and dried meat in cloth, her face solemn but determined. She had not questioned her father's decision, had not argued against the risk he was taking. In some ways, this worried Mason more than if she had protested. It suggested she understood exactly how dire their situation was. Hannah, by contrast, was subdued, her usual exuberance dampened by the gravity of their departure. She sat at the table, small fingers carefully sorting herbs that Nova had taught her to identify, placing them in labeled pouches. What about Patch? She asked suddenly, looking up at Mason. We can't leave him alone. Mason knelt beside his younger daughter, meeting her worried gaze. Dr. Miller is coming to check on us today, remember? I left a note explaining that we've gone to the high pasture to check on cattle after the storm. He'll take care of Patch until we return. But what if those bad men come here looking for Nova? By then we'll be far away, Mason assured her, and there will be no sign that Nova was ever here. The explanation seemed to satisfy Hannah, who returned to her task. Mason watched her for a moment, marveling at her resilience. At 10 years old, she was facing the prospect of abandoning her home and undertaking a dangerous journey with remarkable composure. Elena would be proud. The thought of his late wife sent a familiar pang through his chest, but it was accompanied now by something else, a sense that she would approve of what he was doing. Not just sheltering Nova, but actively protecting her, taking a stand rather than merely surviving. Nova emerged from the bedroom where she had been gathering her few possessions. The bruises on her face had faded to yellowish smudges, and she moved without the stiffness of those first days. Her dark eyes met Mason's across the room. The sun rises soon, she said. We should be moving. Mason nodded. Sarah, help Hannah with her coat. Extra layers, it's colder in the high country. As his daughters prepared, Mason stepped outside onto the porch for a final assessment. The temperature had dropped overnight, freezing the top layer of snow into a crust that crunched beneath his boots. The sky was clear, promising another bright day, good for visibility but also making them easier to spot from a distance. They would need to keep to the tree line as much as possible. Nova joined him, her breath clouding in the cold air. Your sheriff friend, she said quietly. Will he guess what you've done? Eventually, Mason scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of movement. But he won't pursue immediately. He'll give us time. You trust him that much, even though you are no longer friends? Mason considered the question. Robert Colton is a complicated man. We've had our differences, but he's fair, and he doesn't trust Blackwell any more than I do. Nova glanced briefly at Mason's arm where the tattoo was hidden beneath his sleeve, but said nothing more about it. Time to go, he said, turning back to the door. The girls are ready. They left as the first rays of sun touched the tops of the pines. Mason led, breaking trail through the crusted snow, with Hannah behind him, then Nova, and Sarah bringing up the rear with the rifle. They moved in silence, conserving energy, their breath forming white clouds that hung briefly in the still air before dissipating. Mason had chosen their route carefully. Rather than taking the main trail that eventually led to town, they headed west, toward a narrow ravine that cut through the foothills. It was a longer path to the hidden valley, but one less likely to be watched or followed. The going was difficult from the start. The snow depth varied unpredictably, in some places merely ankle deep, in others reaching past their knees. Hannah struggled the most, her short legs laboring through the deeper drifts. After the third time she stumbled, Mason lifted her onto his shoulders, ignoring her protest that she could manage. Save your strength, he told her. The ravine will be easier walking. By midday, they had reached the entrance to the ravine, a narrow gap between towering rock walls that rose nearly 100 feet on either side. The snow here was shallower, scoured by wind that funneled through the natural corridor. They paused to rest, drinking from canteens and eating small portions of the food Sarah had packed. How far to this hidden valley? Nova asked, surveying the path ahead. At this pace, we'll reach the high ridge by tomorrow afternoon, Mason replied. The valley lies just beyond. There's a cave system halfway up where we can shelter for the night. Sarah, who had been scanning their back trail with the attentiveness Mason had taught her, suddenly tensed. Pa, she said quietly. Riders, at least 3, coming fast from the direction of town. Mason rose immediately, moving to where Sarah stood. In the distance, barely visible against the white landscape, dark figures on horseback moved with purpose toward their cabin. Even at this distance, Mason could see they were following the tracks that led from his property, tracks that would eventually reveal their westward turn. Is it the sheriff? Hannah asked, her voice small. No, Mason said grimly. Sheriff wouldn't bring a posse this soon. That's Blackwell. Nova's face hardened. He moves faster than we anticipated. And he'll move faster still once he finds our trail, Mason said. We need to pick up our pace. As they gathered their packs to continue, Nova paused, her hand on Mason's arm. There's something I haven't told you, she said, her voice low enough that the girls couldn't hear. About Blackwell, about why he's so determined. Mason waited, sensing the importance of what was coming. The sacred site marked on our map, Nova continued. It does contain gold, as he believes, but it also holds the entrance to a vast cave system where my ancestors hid from Spanish conquistadors centuries ago. Inside those caves are writings, ancient knowledge recorded on stone about healing, about speaking with spirits, about seeing beyond the veil of this world. And Blackwell wants this knowledge? Mason asked, skeptical. No, he wants to destroy it. Nova's eyes flashed with controlled anger. He believes it is devil worship, heathen magic. His true aim is to obliterate all trace of my people's wisdom, to salt the earth where our sacred site stood. The gold is merely a bonus to fund his crusade. Mason absorbed this information, understanding now the depth of Blackwell's obsession. This wasn't merely about stolen property or even wealth. It was about eradication, the complete destruction of a culture and its knowledge. All the more reason to keep moving, he said finally. We'll talk more when we reach the caves tonight. They pressed on through the ravine, the towering walls providing some protection from watching eyes. Mason set a punishing pace, aware that their lead was diminishing with every hour. Hannah, now walking again, kept up bravely, though Mason could see fatigue setting in around her eyes. The afternoon brought a change in the weather. Clouds moved in from the west, heavy and gray, promising more snow by nightfall. While this would erase their tracks, it would also make travel more hazardous, particularly in the narrow ravine where flash floods of snowmelt could form without warning. As the first flakes began to fall, Mason spotted what he was looking for, a break in the ravine wall, a narrow cleft that led to a series of caves he had discovered years ago while hunting in these mountains. He guided the group toward it, helping Hannah over the rough ground at the entrance. We'll shelter here, he said as they reached the mouth of the cave. The storm will cover our tracks. Even if Blackwell finds the ravine, he won't know which way we went. The cave opened into a surprisingly large chamber, its ceiling high enough that Mason could stand upright. The floor was sandy and dry, protected from the elements by the overhanging rock. Small tunnels led deeper into the mountain, though Mason had never explored them fully. "It's so dark," Hannah whispered, her voice echoing slightly. "Not for long," Mason replied, unpacking the small lantern he had brought. Soon a warm golden light filled the space, revealing ancient soot marks on the ceiling where others had made fires in centuries past. Sarah set about organizing their supplies while Nova helped Hannah out of her snow-crusted outer clothing. Mason stepped back to the cave entrance, watching the snow fall more heavily now, already beginning to drift against the rocks. "Will they follow us in this?" Sarah asked, coming to stand beside him. Mason considered the question. "Not tonight, they'll seek shelter themselves. But Blackwell strikes me as a man who doesn't give up easily. They'll be on our trail again at first light. What happens when we reach this hidden valley? We can't stay there forever." "No," Mason agreed, "but it buys us time to figure out our next move." He glanced back at Nova, who was showing Hannah how to arrange pine boughs as bedding, and to decide what to do about Nova's sacred objects. Sarah followed his gaze. "You believe her story, then? About the ancient knowledge in the caves?" "I believe she believes it," Mason said carefully. "And I believe Blackwell is dangerous enough that it doesn't matter if the story is true. He's already killed her entire tribe. He won't hesitate to kill again." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the snow transform the landscape. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice softer. "Pa, I haven't seen you like this in a long time. Taking action, making plans." Mason looked down at his daughter, seeing in her face a maturity beyond her 15 years. "I haven't felt like this in a long time," he admitted. "Not since your mother died. She would be proud of you." Sarah's hand found his, squeezing briefly. "I am too." "Pa," Sarah said quietly, "I haven't seen you like this in a long time. Taking action, making plans." Mason looked down at his daughter, seeing in her face a maturity beyond her 15 years. "I haven't felt like this in a long time," he admitted. "Not since your mother died." Sarah hesitated, then voiced the question that had been weighing on her. "Is it because of Nova?" Mason seemed surprised by the directness of her question. "Partly," he acknowledged, "but it's more than that. It's like waking up after a long sleep." Sarah nodded, processing his words. "I was afraid at first," she confessed. "Not just of the danger she brought, but of how she was changing you. I've been taking care of our family for so long, I didn't know if I could trust someone else to—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the complex emotions. "To matter to us?" Mason finished gently. "Yes." Sarah looked toward Nova, who was showing Hannah how to arrange the pine boughs. "But I've been watching her. The way she respects our ways but shares her own. How she never tries to replace Mom, but still cares for us. She's strong in a way that reminds me of the stories you used to tell about Mom." "Your mother would have liked her," Mason said softly. Sarah's eyes glistened with unexpected tears. "I think so too." Her hand found his, squeezing briefly. "Mom would be proud of you. I am too." The simple statement hit Mason with unexpected force. He had been so focused on providing the basics for his daughters that he had never considered whether they were proud of him, whether he was the kind of father who inspired such feelings. The realization that Sarah at least saw something in him worth admiring was both humbling and heartening. "Let's get a fire started," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "It gets cold in these caves at night." As darkness fell completely, they gathered around the small fire Mason had built near the cave entrance, where the smoke could escape without filling their shelter. They ate a simple meal of cornbread and jerky, conserving their supplies for the journey ahead. Hannah, exhausted from the day's travel, fell asleep almost immediately afterward, curled up on the pine boughs with Sarah's coat as an extra blanket. Sarah remained awake longer, cleaning the rifle and checking their remaining ammunition before finally settling down to sleep herself. Mason and Nova sat on opposite sides of the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. "Your daughters are strong," Nova said after a while. "Like their father." "They're stronger than I am," Mason replied. "They've had to be." Nova studied him across the fire. You carry a great burden of guilt about your wife's death, about the life your daughters have lived in your shadow. It weighs on you with every step. Mason didn't respond immediately. The Apache woman's perception was uncomfortably accurate. You see a lot for someone who's only known me a few days. I was training to be my tribe's medicine woman before. Nova trailed off, pain flickering across her face. Part of that training is learning to read what lies beneath the surface. The sickness of the Shurad that can manifest as sickness of the body. And what sickness do you see in Mapi? Mason asked, not entirely sure he wanted the answer. Not sickness, Nova corrected gently. Wounding, a deep cut that never healed properly. She paused. When a wound is allowed to close with dirt still inside, it festers. Sometimes it must be reopened to be properly cleansed. The metaphor struck uncomfortably close to home. Mason had indeed buried his grief rather than processing it, had sealed it away where it couldn't be examined or healed. And you think helping you is somehow reopening that wound? He asked. I think the ancestors guided me to your door for a reason, Nova replied. Perhaps to help you as much as for you to help me. Mason shifted uncomfortably. I don't believe in guided paths or destiny. I believe in choices and consequences. The two are not as separate as you think, Nova said with a small smile. The choices we make create the path we walk, but sometimes the path was already there, waiting for us to find it. Sarah watched this exchange from the shadows of the doorway, torn between relief at seeing her father actually engage in meaningful conversation and unease at the growing connection between him and Nova. Part of her, the part that had assumed the responsibility for protecting their broken family, warned caution. But another part, perhaps the 15-year-old girl who had lost her childhood too soon, recognized something healing in her father's voice that had been absent for years. She retreated silently to her sleeping area, fingering the locket containing her mother's portrait. What would you want for him, Mom? She whispered. The question hung unanswered in the darkness, but Sarah felt a weight she hadn't known she carried begin to shift slightly. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks upward toward the darkened cave ceiling. Outside, the snow continued to fall, insulating their shelter in a blanket of white silence. Tomorrow will be difficult, Mason said, changing the subject. The ridge is steep, and the snow will make footing treacherous. We should rest while we can. Nova nodded, accepting the end of their conversation. I will take first watch, she offered. I require less sleep than most. Sarah, who had not yet fallen asleep, watched through half-closed eyes as her father and Nova spoke by the fire. She noticed how her father's rigid posture had gradually relaxed, how his voice had softened when speaking to the Apache woman. It was a side of him Sarah had nearly forgotten existed. As a child, she had resented her father's withdrawal after her mother's death, had blamed him for forcing her to become the mother Hannah never had. Now, with the perspective that came from their dangerous journey, she began to understand how grief had paralyzed him, not through lack of love, but through its overwhelming presence. And Nova had somehow reached through that paralysis. Sarah felt a sudden surge of gratitude toward the woman who had brought danger upon their door, but also, unexpectedly, brought her father back to life. Whatever happened next, that gift alone was precious beyond measure. Mason wanted to refuse, to insist that he would keep the first vigil, but something in Nova's calm assurance stopped him. She was not offering out of politeness, but out of capability, and he had to admit, bone-tired from breaking trail all day. Wake me in 4 hours, he said finally, settling himself against the cave wall where he could see both the entrance and his sleeping daughters. As his eyes grew heavy, Mason watched Nova silhouetted against the fire, her straight back and proud posture a testament to her resilience. Despite everything she had endured, the loss of her entire tribe, torture at Blackwell's hands, flight through a blizzard, she remained unbroken. There was a lesson in that, if he cared to learn it. His last thought before sleep claimed him was that perhaps Elena had sent Nova to them after all, not through mystical means, but through the simple alignment of need and circumstance, of wounds that echoed one another and strengths that complemented perfectly. Outside, the snow fell more heavily, erasing all trace of their passage through the wilderness. While in the cave, 4 souls rested in momentary safety, unaware that their pursuer was closer than they had imagined, and more determined than ever to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. The storm raged through the night, blanketing the landscape in a fresh coat of white. By morning, it had moved eastward, leaving behind a crystalline blue sky and a transformed world. Mason stood at the cave entrance, assessing the conditions. The new snow was knee-deep in places, pristine and unmarked, erasing all trace of their previous day's journey. "How bad?" Sarah asked, coming to stand beside him. "Challenging but passable," Mason replied. "The ridge trail will be tricky, lots of exposure to wind and drops on either side." Sarah nodded, taking in the information with the practical acceptance he had come to rely on. "Hannah's still tired from yesterday, and I noticed Nova favoring her right side. I think her old injuries are bothering her more than she lets on." Mason glanced back to where Nova was helping Hannah fold the blankets they'd used overnight. He'd observed the same thing, a slight stiffness in Nova's movements, carefully concealed but visible to his trained eye. "We'll take it slower today," he decided. Better to arrive at the valley after nightfall than to push too hard and risk an injury. They breakfasted on the remaining cornbread, washing it down with melted snow, warmed by the small fire they'd rekindled. As they packed their belongings, Mason laid out the day's route. "We'll follow the ravine for another 3 miles, then climb to the ridge. The trail narrows there. Single file. Watch your footing. Once we cross the ridge, it's a 2-mile descent into the hidden valley." "What's in this valley?" Hannah asked, her natural curiosity returning after a night's rest. "A small cabin built by trappers decades ago," Mason explained. "I found it years back, repaired it enough to make it usable as a shelter during hunting trips. It's not much, but it's solid and hidden from view unless you know exactly where to look." Nova listened attentively, her dark eyes thoughtful. "And beyond this valley, if we need to continue on, there's a pass that leads west, toward the territorial border. Rough going in winter, but possible with proper preparation." The implication was clear. If necessary, they could leave the territory entirely, beyond Blackwell's reach or influence. It was a last resort, but Mason wanted Nova to know the option existed. They set out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Mason again took the lead, breaking trail through the fresh powder, setting a deliberate but sustainable pace. Hannah followed, then Nova, with Sarah bringing up the rear, rifle at the ready. They moved in silence, conserving energy, each lost in their own thoughts. The ravine gradually widened, its walls becoming less steep as they approached the point where they would begin their ascent to the ridge. Mason called a brief halt, allowing everyone to catch their breath and drink from their canteens. "The climb begins just ahead," he said, pointing to a faint line that zigzagged up the northern wall of the ravine. "It's an old game trail, narrow but manageable. Watch for loose rocks under the snow." As they prepared to continue, Sarah suddenly stiffened, her head turning sharply to look back the way they had come. "Pa," she said quietly, urgency in her voice. "I heard something." Mason motioned for everyone to be still, straining his ears. For several seconds, there was nothing but the soft sigh of wind through the pines. Then he heard it too, the distant but unmistakable sound of voices carried on the clear mountain air. "How far?" he asked Sarah. "Can't tell exactly. The ravine carries sound strangely, but close enough to hear, maybe half a mile." Mason made a quick calculation. Blackwell and his men had found the ravine despite the storm, which meant they were better trackers than he'd given them credit for. Or perhaps they had local knowledge he hadn't anticipated. "Change of plans," he said decisively. "We climb now, but not on the trail." Hannah struggled with the height, but persevered with determination beyond her years, her small face set in concentration. They were perhaps halfway up when the voices became clearer. 3 men at least, their words still indistinct, but their presence undeniable. Mason increased his pace, ignoring the burning in his thighs and the raw scrapes on his hands where the rock had torn through his gloves. "They'll see our tracks at the base of the cleft," Sarah said between labored breaths. "Can't be helped," Mason replied. "We need to reach the ridge before they round that last bend in the ravine. Once we're up, the wind will have scoured most of the snow away, less sign to follow." The final portion of the climb was the steepest, requiring them to pull themselves up using roots and rock outcroppings. Mason reached the top first, then turned to help the others. He lifted Hannah bodily the last few feet, then reached down to offer Nova a hand. She accepted it without hesitation. her grip surprisingly strong despite her obvious fatigue. Sarah was last, refusing assistance as she hauled herself over the edge through sheer determination. They all lay in the snow for a moment, catching their breath, before Mason urged them to their feet. "No time to rest yet," he said. "The ridge trail is just ahead." The ridge stretched before them like the spine of some enormous beast, jagged with rock outcroppings and stunted winds bent by constant wind. As Mason had predicted, much of the snow had been blown clear, leaving patches of bare rock interspersed with deep drifts. The trail, such as it was, followed the very crest of the ridge, with steep drop-offs on either side. "Stay close to the center," Mason instructed. "The edges can be unstable, especially with the new snow." They had traveled perhaps a quarter-mile along the ridge when a shout echoed up from the ravine below. Mason motioned everyone down, crawling carefully to the edge to peer over. 3 riders had reached the base of the cleft they had climbed. One had dismounted and was examining the snow, pointing upward. Even from this distance, Mason could make out the fine coat and authoritative stance of Ezra Blackwell. "They found our trail," he reported, rejoining the others. "They'll have to leave the horses to follow us up, but that won't stop them for long." "How much farther to the valley?" Sarah asked, checking the rifle's loading mechanism with practiced hands. 2 miles along this ridge, then the descent. We can make it before they catch up, but we need to move fast." They pressed on, the wind growing stronger as they traversed the exposed ridgeline. It numbed faces and stole breath, driving occasional flurries of loose snow into stinging clouds that temporarily blinded them. Hannah stumbled more frequently now, exhaustion taking its toll. After her 3rd fall, Nova scooped the child up in her arms despite her own fatigue. "I can carry her for a while," she said when Mason started to protest. "Your strength is needed to break trail." Mason nodded, recognizing the logic even as he admired Nova's fortitude. They continued forward, the ridge beginning a gradual descent toward a saddle between 2 higher peaks. It was at this lowest point that the trail to the hidden valley branched off, following a narrow defile that was invisible until one was directly above it. They had almost reached this crucial juncture when a shot rang out, the report echoing off the surrounding mountains. The bullet struck rocks several yards behind them, sending chips flying. "Down," Mason ordered, pulling Sarah and Nova, still carrying Hannah, behind a large boulder. Another shot followed, closer this time. "They've reached the ridge," Sarah said, her voice remarkably steady. "But they're still too far for accurate shooting." Mason assessed their position. They were perhaps 500 yards from the entrance to the defile, close, but still exposed to fire if they attempted to cross the open ground that remained. "We need a diversion," he said, his mind racing through options. "Something to keep them pinned down while the rest of you make it to the valley trail." Nova's eyes widened in understanding. "You mean to stay behind?" "Just long enough to buy you time," Mason confirmed. "Sarah knows the way from here. The cabin has supplies, enough to last a week or more. I'll join you by nightfall." "No," Nova said firmly. "This is my fight, not yours. Your daughters need you." "And they need you to reach safety," Mason countered. "You're the one Blackwell wants. If he sees me, he might assume you've gone in another direction." A 3rd shot struck closer still, emphasizing the urgency of their situation. Sarah, who had been watching the back trail, spoke up. "They've split up," she reported. 2 continuing along the ridge, 1 circling lower down. "They're trying to surround us." Mason made his decision. "Sarah, take your sister and Nova. Follow the defile all the way down. Don't stop until you reach the cabin. Bar the door and windows." Sarah hesitated, clearly torn between duty to her sister and reluctance to leave her father. Mason placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'll be right behind you," he promised. "But I need to know you 3 are safe first." After a moment, Sarah nodded. "Be careful, Pa." Mason turned to Nova, who still held Hannah in her arms. The child's face was buried against Nova's shoulder, small body trembling with cold and fear. "Keep them safe," Mason said quietly. Nova met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "I will protect them with my life," she vowed, "but you must return to us." "I will." Mason waited until they were ready to move, then positioned himself to provide covering fire. "Go now. Stay low, I'll draw their attention." As Sarah led Nova and Hannah toward the defile entrance, Mason raised the rifle and fired two quick shots in the direction of their pursuers. He was rewarded with shouts and a temporary cessation of enemy fire. He fired again, then quickly repositioned behind a different boulder, anticipating return fire. It came immediately, a barrage that chipped away at his previous position. Mason allowed himself a grim smile. They were focused entirely on him now, giving the others the chance they needed to reach the valley trail. He fired once more, then glanced back to confirm his family had disappeared into the defile. What he saw instead froze his blood. Hannah had broken away from Nova and was running back toward him, her small figure stark against the snow. "Pa," she cried. "Pa, don't stay!" Mason abandoned his cover, sprinting toward his daughter with desperate speed. Behind him, he heard shouts of triumph as their pursuers spotted the movement. A bullet kicked up snow just feet from where he ran. "Hannah, down!" he yelled. But the child kept coming, her face streaked with tears. He reached her just as another shot rang out. Mason swept Hannah into his arms, turning his back to shield her with his body, fully expecting to feel the impact of a bullet. Instead, he heard a grunt of pain from behind him, followed by the clatter of a falling rifle. Mason turned to see one of Blackwell's men clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Further back along the ridge, Sheriff Colton stood with his rifle raised, a tendril of smoke still rising from the barrel. "Reed," Colton shouted, "get the hell out of there!" Mason needed no further urging. With Hannah clinging to his neck, he ran for the defile where Sarah and Nova waited. Behind him, more shots were exchanged, Colton providing covering fire as the remaining pursuers sought shelter. As he reached the entrance to the narrow passage, Mason cast one last glance back. Colton had advanced along the ridge, forcing Blackwell and his uninjured companion to retreat. The sheriff raised a hand briefly in Mason's direction, a gesture of acknowledgement and perhaps forgiveness for old wrongs. Then Mason was in the defile, hurrying down the steep path toward the hidden valley and whatever confrontation awaited them there. The hidden valley opened before them like a revelation, protected on all sides by towering cliffs, inaccessible only through the narrow defile they had just ascended. It was a natural fortress. Ancient pines stood sentinel along its perimeter, their branches heavy with snow. A frozen creek meandered through the center, its ice gleaming in the late afternoon light. Mason carried Hannah across the valley floor, following Sarah and Nova toward a small cabin nestled against the western cliff face. The structure was nearly invisible from a distance, its weathered logs and snow-covered roof blending into the surrounding landscape. "Pa," Hannah whispered against his neck, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry I ran back. I was scared for you." "I know, little one," Mason replied, holding her tighter. "But you must listen to me next time. It's too dangerous to disobey when we're in trouble." The child nodded solemnly. "Sheriff Colton saved us, didn't he?" He did. Mason still couldn't quite believe it himself. Robert Colton had followed them into the mountains, presumably alone, and had intervened at the critical moment. Why? To uphold the law, certainly, but there seemed to be more to it, something personal in the way he had positioned himself between Mason's family and danger. They reached the cabin as the sun began its descent behind the western ridge. Mason set Hannah down gently, then helped Sarah push open the heavy wooden door. Inside, it was cold and musty from disuse, but structurally sound. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and chairs occupied the center, and simple bunks lined the back wall. "It's not much," Mason said, "but it will keep us safe and warm." Sarah immediately set about organizing their belongings, while Nova helped Hannah out of her snow-encrusted outer clothing. Mason checked the cabin's sparse supplies, some dry firewood, basic cooking utensils, several wool blankets stored in a cedar chest to protect them from mice. "We should get a fire started," he said, moving to the hearth. "Night comes early in these mountains, and the temperature will drop quickly." As he arranged kindling in the fireplace, Mason's mind raced with questions. Had Colton managed to delay Blackwell and his remaining man? For how long? Would the sheriff follow them to the valley, or return to town to gather reinforcements? And perhaps most pressing, what was their next move? The fire caught easily, hungry flames consuming the dry pine. Soon warmth began to spread through the small space, bringing with it a measure of comfort and safety. Sarah melted snow in a pot for drinking water, while Nova unpacked the remaining food supplies. "Mason," Nova said quietly, coming to kneel beside him at the hearth, Your sheriff friend, can he be trusted completely? Mason considered the question. Colton and I have history, not all of it good, but he's an honorable man in his way. He wouldn't have intervened if he sided with Blackwell. Yet he came to your cabin asking about me, Nova pointed out, following Blackwell's instructions. Doing his job, Mason corrected. There's a difference. Nova didn't look entirely convinced, but nodded her acceptance. What happens now? Blackwell knows where we were headed. Even if your friend delayed him, he will come. Mason knew she was right. The hidden valley was defensible, but it was also a potential trap if Blackwell brought enough men. They needed to make decisions quickly. We rest tonight, he said. At first light, we assess our options. Depending on whether Colton returns, we may need to continue west, across the territorial border. Nova reached for her ever-present pouch, opening it to remove the marked stone and the small piece of hide with faded drawings. These are what Blackwell seeks so desperately. The map showing the location of our sacred site and the key to interpreting it. She ran her fingers over the stone's etched surface. Perhaps I should continue alone. Draw him away from your family. That's not going to happen, Mason said firmly. We're in this together now. A small smile touched Nova's lips. Hannah appeared at Nova's side, her eyes wide with curiosity. Can I see? She asked, pointing to the objects Nova held. After a moment's hesitation, Nova nodded, carefully placing the stone in Hannah's small hands. This has been passed down through my family for many generations. The markings tell a story that only certain people can read. Hannah studied the stone with serious concentration. It looks like the mark on Pa's arm, she observed, the one he never talks about. The markings are similar to the one on your father's arm, Nova explained simply. Hannah looked up with curiosity. Is that why you're helping Nova, Pa? I'm helping Nova because it's the right thing to do, Mason said. Sometimes that's enough. Hannah nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. She handed the stone back to Nova carefully, then moved to help Sarah with the meal preparation. Nova rewrapped the sacred objects and returned them to her pouch. I believe in making choices I can live with, Mason replied. The rest is just... He trailed off, unsure how to finish without giving offense. Stories, Nova suggested. Perhaps, but stories have power too. They shape how we see the world, how we understand our place in it. She rose gracefully to her feet. I will help Sarah with the meal. As night settled fully over the valley, they ate a simple dinner around the fire. Hannah, exhausted from the day's journey and emotional strain, fell asleep almost immediately afterward, curled up on one of the bunks beneath a wool blanket. Sarah stayed awake longer, cleaning the rifle and organizing their remaining supplies with methodical precision. You should rest too, Mason told her. I'll take first watch. Sarah nodded, moving to the bunk beside her sister. She paused, looking back at her father. Do you think Sheriff Colton will come? I don't know, Mason admitted, but if he does, it will be as a friend, not an enemy. And Blackwell? We'll deal with him if we have to. Sarah seemed to accept this, settling onto the bunk with the rifle close at hand. Soon her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Mason moved to the cabin's single window, a small square of glass reinforced with iron bars, designed more to keep animals out than people in. Through it, he could see the valley bathed in moonlight, ethereally beautiful and utterly still. Nova joined him, her presence quiet but solid at his side. Your elder daughter is much like you, she observed. Strong, steady, protective. Too much like me, Mason said ruefully. She's had to grow up too fast because I couldn't, because I withdrew after their mother died. Grief changes us, Nova said, but it need not define us forever. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, just above where the tattoo marked his skin beneath his sleeve. You are finding your way back now. The simple touch sent warmth through Mason that had nothing to do with the fire. He looked down at Nova, seeing her clearly in the soft glow of the firelight, the proud angle of her cheekbones, the quiet strength in her eyes, the resilience that had carried her through unimaginable loss. Something shifted within him, a barrier crumbling that had stood firm for 10 long years. When Elena died, he said, the words coming with unexpected ease, it felt like the world ended, like there was no point to anything anymore. I kept breathing, kept working, kept providing for the girls, but I wasn't really living. And now, Nova asked softly. Now, Mason searched for the words. Now I feel like I'm waking up, like I've been asleep for a decade and suddenly everything is in sharp focus again. He met her gaze. It's terrifying. Nova's hand remained on his arm, her touch an anchor. The Apache believed that grief is a river we must cross. Some fight against the current and drown. Others surrender to it completely and are washed away. The wise ones allow themselves to feel its full force while still swimming toward the distant shore. She paused. You have been treading water in the middle of that river for many years, Mason Reed. Perhaps it is time to reach for the shore. The metaphor struck Mason with the force of truth. He had indeed been suspended in grief, neither moving forward nor allowing himself to be carried away. Stasis, survival without living. I don't know if I remember how, he admitted. You remember, Nova said with certainty. I have seen it in how you protect your daughters, in how you came to my aid despite the risk, in how you face Blackwell rather than hiding from the danger he represents. Her voice softened. The man you were before sorrow claimed you. He is still there. He is still you. Mason was about to respond when a sound from outside caught his attention, the faint crunch of snow under a careful footstep. He tensed, immediately alert, hand moving to his pistol. Someone's approaching, he whispered. Single person. From the east. Nova moved silently to where Sarah slept, gently waking her with a hand over her mouth to prevent any startled sound. Sarah understood immediately, reaching for the rifle as she rose. She moved to Hannah, ready to protect her sister if it necessary. Mason positioned himself beside the door, drawing his pistol. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped just outside the cabin. A moment of silence followed. Then a familiar voice called out softly, Reed, it's Colton. I'm alone. Mason exchanged glances with Nova and Sarah before responding. Come in slowly, hands where I can see them. The door opened carefully. Robert Colton stood silhouetted against the moonlit snow, his hands held away from his body, showing he carried no weapon. Mason lowered his pistol, gesturing for the sheriff to enter. Colton stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. His face was weathered from hours in the cold, a deep weariness evident in the set of his shoulders. You look half frozen, Mason observed, closing the door behind him. There's coffee in the pot if you want it. I'd be obliged, Colton replied, moving toward the fire with the careful movements of a man fighting exhaustion. Sarah poured a cup of the strong black liquid and handed it to the sheriff without a word before returning to Hannah, who had awoken and was watching the proceedings with wide, uncertain eyes. Colton drank deeply, then faced Mason directly. Blackwell's man, the one I shot, is dead, bled out before they could get him to town. The other one took him back on his horse. Blackwell himself is still out there, somewhere between here and Shadow Creek. Alone? Mason asked. For now. Colton set down the empty cup. But he sent his remaining man back with a message for the telegraph operator. He's calling in reinforcements from his mining operation over in Nevada. Professional guns, from what I gathered. 6, maybe 8 men. The news hung heavily in the cabin. 8 armed men, led by a fanatic, all converging on their location. The odds were shifting dramatically against them. How long do we have? Mason asked. 2 days, maybe 3. Depends on the weather and how fast they can travel. Colton glanced at Nova, who stood silently by the fire. Ma'am, I don't know what you're carrying that Blackwell wants so badly, but it's got him acting like a man possessed. Nova met the sheriff's gaze steadily. It is the heritage of my people, sacred knowledge that he seeks to destroy because he fears what he does not understand. Colton nodded slowly. I figured it was something like that. Blackwell strikes me as the type who can't abide anything that doesn't fit his narrow view of the world. He turned back to Mason. I need to know where you stand in all this, Reed. Are you prepared to risk everything, your life, your daughter's safety, for this woman and her sacred objects? The question was direct, challenging, but not unkind. It cut to the heart of Mason's transformation over the past days, from a man existing in numb isolation to one who had chosen to take a stand, to protect someone who needed protection, regardless of the path. I am, Mason said simply. A ghost of a smile touched Colton's tired face. Then it seems we've come full circle, you and I. Back to Fort Gibson, standing against injustice together instead of divided by it. The reference to their shared past, the incident that had driven them apart years ago, was unexpected. At Fort Gibson, Mason had defied orders to protect an Apache family from soldiers intent on removing them from their ancestral land. Colton, bound by duty in the chain of command, had stood with the military. The resulting confrontation had left both men wounded, physically and otherwise. "You've changed, Robert," Mason observed. "So have you." Colton looked around at the small cabin, at Sarah and Hannah, at Nova standing proud despite all she had endured. "I think I'm starting to understand why." In that moment, something shifted between the two men, not a return to their former friendship, but perhaps the beginning of a new understanding, built on shared purpose rather than shared history. Sarah, sitting beside Hannah on the bunk, witnessed the exchange between her father and the sheriff with a sense of wonder. The world she had known, small, isolated, defined by loss and routine, was expanding before her eyes. Her father was reconnecting not just with Nova, but with his past, with parts of himself she had never fully known. She caught Nova's gaze across the room and offered a small but genuine smile. Not the polite, careful expression she had maintained until now, but one of understanding and nascent trust. Nova returned it with a slight nod that conveyed mutual respect between two strong women who had each carried burdens far beyond their years. Sarah realized then that she wasn't losing her place in the family as she had feared. Rather, she was being given the chance to be something she had missed for too long. Not just a surrogate parent, but a daughter, a sister, a young woman with her own future. And Nova, far from being a threat to their family circle, was helping to complete it. "We need a plan," Mason said. "2 days isn't much time." Colton nodded grimly. "No, it isn't, but it might be enough if we're smart about it." He moved to the rough table at the center of the cabin. "Let's figure this out together." As they gathered around the table, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The sensation of pieces falling into place, of a circle finally closing. A circle of healing, of purpose, of return from the wilderness of grief to the land of the living. Whatever awaited them in the coming days, whether victory or defeat, survival or sacrifice, Mason Reed knew with certainty that he was finally, truly awake. And for the first time in 10 long years, fully alive. Dawn broke over the hidden valley, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Mason, Colton, and Nova huddled around the rough wooden table, their faces grave as they finalized their strategy. Sarah stood nearby, listening intently while keeping a watchful eye on Hannah, who slept fitfully on one of the bunks. "Blackwell will approach from the eastern ridge," Colton said, tracing a path on the crude map Mason had sketched in the dust covering the table. "It's the only sensible route with that many men, which makes this narrow pass our best advantage," Mason added, indicating the defile through which they had entered the valley. "One man could hold off several there, at least for a time." Nova studied the map with keen eyes that missed nothing. "And the sacred items, where will they be safest?" The question hung in the air for a moment. The stone and map that Nova carried weren't merely objects. They represented the last remnants of her people's heritage, keys to knowledge that had been preserved for generations. "There's a cave system behind the western waterfall," Mason finally said, "known only to a few hunters. Too small for a man to enter easily, but—" His eyes shifted to Hannah. Sarah understood immediately. "You want Hannah to hide them there." Mason nodded. "She's small enough to slip through the entrance, and brave enough to do it." "I'll take her there myself," Nova offered. "Show her the proper way to place the sacred items. They must be positioned with respect, according to our traditions." As if sensing they were discussing her, Hannah stirred, sitting up and rubbing sleep from her eyes. She looked impossibly small and vulnerable in the large bunk, her dark hair tangled around her face. "Pa," she called, voice still thick with sleep. "Is it time?" Mason crossed to his younger daughter, kneeling beside the bunk. "Almost, little one. Nova has something important to ask of you." Nova joined them, the buckskin pouch clasped reverently in her hands. "Hannah," she said gently, "you have shown great courage on our journey. Now I must ask for your help with a sacred task." Hannah's eyes widened, immediately alert. "The special stone?" "Yes," Nova confirmed. "It must be hidden somewhere safe, somewhere Blackwell cannot reach." Your father knows of such a place, a small cave behind the waterfall, but only someone as small and brave as you can enter it. Rather than fear, excitement bloomed on Hannah's face. Like a secret mission? A rare smile touched Nova's lips. Very much so. A mission to protect something precious. While Nova explained the details to Hannah, Mason drew Sarah aside, his expression solemn. I need you to go with them, he said quietly. Stay with Hannah at the cave until it's safe to return. Sarah's jaw set stubbornly. I should be here, helping you and the sheriff. You will help most by protecting your sister, Mason insisted, then softened his tone. Sarah, if things go badly here, you'll need to lead them south, to the territorial border. Nova knows people there who can help you. The implication was clear. Mason was preparing for the possibility that he might not survive the coming confrontation. Sarah swallowed hard, fighting back sudden tears. You promised you'd be careful, she whispered. Mason pulled his elder daughter into a brief, fierce embrace. And I mean to keep that promise. But a wise man plans for all possibilities. He drew back, looking into eyes so like his own. You're stronger than I was at your age. Stronger than you've been these past 10 years. Sarah nodded once, composing herself with visible effort. We'll be ready to move in 10 minutes. The waterfall on the western edge of the valley was half frozen, great sheets of ice framing a central column of rushing water. Steam rose where the cascade hit the partially frozen pool below, creating a ghostly veil that obscured the cliff face behind it. Nova led Hannah along a narrow ledge that skirted the southern edge of the pool, Sarah following close behind. The path was treacherous with ice, but Nova moved with sure-footed confidence, one hand holding Hannah's, the other bracing against the rock wall. There, she said, pointing to a dark fissure nearly hidden by the ice formations. The entrance your father spoke of. Hannah peered dubiously at the narrow opening. It's awfully small. Perfect for a brave girl, Nova encouraged. Just wide enough for you to slip through. Sarah assessed the opening with a critical eye. What's inside? Your father said it opens into a larger chamber, Nova explained, with a stone altar of sorts, likely a formation shaped by water over centuries. That is where the sacred items must rest. After a brief hesitation, Hannah nodded resolutely. I'll do it. Nova knelt before the child, opening her pouch with ceremonial deliberation. She withdrew the marked stone and the small piece of hide with faded drawings. When you place these inside, she instructed, you must set them with the stone atop the map, both facing east toward the rising sun. She demonstrated the positioning. And you must say these words. She taught Hannah a short phrase in Apache, making her repeat it until the pronunciation was correct. What do they mean? Hannah asked. They mean, guardian of the ancestors, protect this knowledge until it is time for the circle to renew. Nova translated. Hannah practiced the phrase once more, then carefully took the sacred items, cradling them against her chest. I won't let you down, she promised. I know you won't, little healer, Nova said softly. With Sarah's help, Hannah wriggled through the narrow opening, disappearing into the darkness beyond. The minutes that followed were agonizing for the two women waiting outside. Finally, Hannah's small voice called out, confirming she had found the inner chamber and placed the items as instructed. When she emerged, wet but triumphant, there was a new gravity to her young face, as if the responsibility had aged her slightly. It's done, she said simply. Nova touched Hannah's cheek in a gesture of blessing. You have honored my people today. They would call you small, courageous one. A distant crack echoed across the valley. A rifle shot. All three froze, heads turning toward the eastern ridge where Mason and Colton waited. They're here, Sarah said grimly. Mason lay prone behind a fallen pine near the entrance to the defile, Winchester rifle ready. Beside him, Colton checked his ammunition one last time. Neither man spoke. There was nothing left to say. Their plan was simple by necessity. Use the narrow approach to bottleneck Blackwell's men, take out as many as possible before they could establish a foothold in the valley. The first sign of their arrival was subtle. A shower of pebbles dislodged from above, clattering down the slope. Mason's finger tightened on the trigger. Moments later, the first rider appeared at the top of the defile, silhouetted against the morning sky. Wait, Colton murmured. Let them commit to the descent. Mason nodded, forcing himself to patience. One by one, riders appeared, 6 in total, with Blackwell recognizable by his fine coat despite the distance. They began picking their way down the treacherous path, horses struggling in the deep snow. When the lead rider was halfway down, Colton gave the signal. Now! Mason's first shot took the lead rider in the shoulder, toppling him from his horse. The second rider fell as Colton fired, his horse rearing in panic and blocking the narrow trail. Chaos erupted as the remaining men sought cover, hampered by the terrain. 4 left, Colton said tersely, reloading. A barrage of return fire peppered their position, forcing both men to duck behind their cover. When Mason raised his head to take aim again, he saw Blackwell shouting orders, directing his men to fan out along the ridgeline. It was the move they had anticipated and prepared for. Mason fired twice more, forcing the men to keep their heads down, while Colton slipped away to the second position they had prepared. The plan was to create the illusion of more defenders by firing from multiple locations. It might buy them time, but against 6 trained gunmen, the odds remained grim. As Mason reloaded, a burning sensation spread across his left forearm, precisely where the Apache tattoo marked his skin. He pulled back his sleeve, startled to see the faded blue lines standing out more vividly against his skin. For a wild moment, he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. No time to dwell on it. Blackwell's men were advancing, using the rocky outcroppings for cover as they worked their way down into the valley. Mason fired again, then rolled to a new position as bullets chewed the ground where he had lain. The next hour was a deadly game of advance and retreat. Mason and Colton managed to wound 2 more of Blackwell's men, but the remaining 4, including Blackwell himself, continued to press forward methodically. The advantage of the high ground was slipping away. Mason found himself driven back toward the center of the valley, separated from Colton by a deadly crossfire. The burning in his arm had intensified, becoming nearly unbearable. As he crouched behind a rock outcropping, catching his breath, he pulled back his sleeve again. The tattoo was definitely changed, the lines darker, more defined. And was it his imagination, or did they seem to be shifting slightly, like ripples in water? A shout drew his attention. Blackwell had spotted him and was advancing, rifle raised. Mason rolled sideways as the shot splintered the rock where his head had been. He came up firing, but Blackwell had already found new cover. "Reed," Blackwell called out, his cultured voice carrying clearly across the valley. "This doesn't have to end with your death. Give up the Apache woman and her pagan artifacts, and you can walk away." "Like you let her tribe walk away?" Mason shouted back. "They were obstinate, clinging to their heathen beliefs," Blackwell replied. "The woman has poisoned your mind with her superstitions. Those artifacts are cursed." "The only curse here is your ignorance," a new voice rang out. Nova's voice. Mason's heart froze. Nova stood on a rise 50 yards to his left, proud and fearless in the morning light. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was meant to stay hidden with the girls until the fighting ended, one way or another. Blackwell swung his rifle toward her with predatory speed. "There you are, witch. I should have made sure you died with the rest of your devil-worshipping tribe." "Today you face the consequences of that mistake," Nova replied, her voice steady. She raised her hands in what appeared to be a ceremonial gesture, speaking words in Apache that echoed strangely across the valley. Blackwell laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Your magic won't stop bullets, savage." He took careful aim. Mason lunged from cover, desperation lending him speed. He wasn't going to reach her in time. "Nova!" At that instant, several things happened at once. Blackwell fired. Mason felt the tattoo on his arm pulse with unbearable heat, and a massive sheet of snow detached from the ridge above Blackwell, an avalanche triggered by the precise vibrations of Nova's chanted words in the rifle's report. Blackwell had just enough time to look up, eyes widening in horrified realization, before the wall of snow engulfed him and his remaining men. The roar was deafening, drowning out all other sound as tons of snow and ice thundered down the slope. When it subsided, there was only silence in a transformed landscape. Where Blackwell and his men had stood was now a smooth field of fresh snow. No sign remained of their presence, save a single gloved hand protruding grotesquely from the white expanse. Mason staggered toward Nova, his arms still throbbing painfully. She met him halfway, catching him as his knees threatened to buckle. "You knew," he gasped. "You knew the avalanche would come." "I hoped," she corrected. "My people have long known how to sing to the mountains, to ask them for protection when needed. The rest was the ancestors' will." Her gaze dropped to his arm. "May I?" Mason nodded, pulling back his sleeve. The tattoo had returned to normal, faded blue lines against weathered skin. Yet something had changed. He could feel it. The mark was now a part of him in a way it hadn't been before, as if some dormant connection had been awakened. "The protected one," Nova said softly, tracing the pattern with gentle fingers. The mark recognized its purpose today. Before Mason could respond, Colton appeared, limping but alive. Behind him came Sarah and Hannah, emerging cautiously from the trees at the valley's edge. "Is it over?" Sarah called, supporting her sister with one arm, while the other still gripped the rifle. Mason looked from his daughters to Nova to the buried remains of Blackwell and his men. The sun stood high now, turning the valley into a dazzling sea of white broken only by dark islands of pine and stone. Beautiful, peaceful, as if the violence had never happened. "Yes," he said, "it's over." Spring came early to Shadow Creek that year. The snow retreated from the valley floors by late March, and green shoots pushed through the dark earth with determined vigor. At the Reed cabin, life had settled into new rhythms, different from before, but harmonious in their own way. Mason stood on the porch watching Hannah and Nova in the newly fenced garden. They knelt side by side, Hannah's dark head bent close to Nova's as they planted rows of herbs, some familiar, others exotic varieties Nova had sourced from trading partners to the south. The little girl had taken to calling them her medicine plants, tending them with the same dedication she showed to injured animals. Sarah emerged from the barn, carrying a bucket of fresh milk. At 16, she seemed taller somehow, more confident. The burden of being the family's emotional center had eased, allowing her to blossom in unexpected ways. She had even begun riding into town once a week for proper schooling, something she had resisted before, unwilling to leave Hannah alone with their withdrawn father. "Sheriff's coming," she announced, setting down the bucket. "Just crested the North Ridge." Mason nodded, unsurprised. Robert Colton made the ride out regularly now, ostensibly to check on their welfare. But more often to share a meal and stories of their army days. The good ones, not the dark memories that had driven them apart. The bond between them had been reforged, stronger now for having been broken and mended. The events in the Hidden Valley had been recorded officially as an accident, travelers caught in a late-season avalanche. No one questioned this account too closely. The people of Shadow Creek had their suspicions about the Apache woman now living openly at the Reed Ranch. But Colton's evident approval silenced most gossip. As for the sacred artifacts, they remained hidden in the cave behind the waterfall, visited regularly by Nova and Hannah for ceremonies of remembrance and gratitude. Nova had begun teaching both girls the language and traditions of her people, ensuring that something of the Apache wisdom would survive. Mason descended the porch steps as Colton's horse trotted into the yard. The sheriff dismounted with a grin, reaching into his saddlebag. "Mail day," he announced, pulling out several envelopes, including one from that Apache settlement in Arizona territory that Nova's been corresponding with. Nova looked up from her planting, eyes bright with interest. She had discovered distant cousins from a related tribe living near the territorial border and had established contact, sharing what remained of her people's knowledge in exchange for their support in preserving it. As the others gathered around to see the mail, Mason hung back slightly, watching them. His family expanded now, richer for the addition of Nova and the renewed presence of old friends. The hollow emptiness that had been his constant companion for a decade was gone, replaced by something he had almost forgotten how to recognize: contentment. Later that evening, after the girls had gone to bed and Colton had ridden back to town, Mason and Nova sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. The spring air carried the scent of pine and new growth, clean and promising. "I dreamed of Elena last night," Mason said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken his late wife's name without pain. She was standing in a field of wildflowers, smiling. She looked at peace. Nova's hand found his in the darkness. "The Apache believe our loved ones never truly leave us. They watch over us from the spirit world, guiding our steps when we lose our way." "Like she guided you to our door that night in the snowstorm?" Mason asked, only half joking. Perhaps. Nova smiled, the expression visible even in the dim light. The circle of life has many mysteries. We see only a small part of its pattern. Mason looked down at their joined hands, then up at the star-filled ski. The tattoo on his arm, yeah. The mark of the protected one seemed to warm slightly, a gentle reminder of connections that transcended understanding. Whatever pattern brought us together, he said, I'm grateful for it. Nova leaned against his shoulder, her presence solid and real and infinitely precious. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient courses, bearing silent witness to endings and beginnings, to circles broken and remade, to the enduring resilience of the human heart that learns, at last, to beat again.